Good evening. 6 years ago today at Miami Beach, Richard Milhous Nixon accomplished perhaps the most remarkable political comeback in American history. After campaigns in 1960 and 62 had branded him a loser, Nixon won the Republican presidential nomination and was on his way to the White House. And on this night, August 8th in 1968, he had this to say.
America's in trouble today not because her people have failed, but because her leaders have failed. And what America needs are leaders to match the greatness of her people.
Because her leaders have failed. Now, 6 years later, Mr. Nixon's own leadership has failed. And tonight, 2 hours from now, he's going on television reportedly to tell the nation that he is quitting, the ultimate victim of the Watergate scandal that destroyed his administration. That is the report that comes from all sides, from high-ranking White House aides, from associates of Vice President Ford, who soon would become the 38th President of the United States, from senators and from congressmen. And Ford's staff already has begun work on what he told them would be a, quote, smooth and orderly transition, unquote, to the presidency. Before he makes that television speech tonight, Mr. Nixon has invited congressional leaders of both parties to meet with him, and presumably will tell them then the decision he's made. That meeting to begin in a half hour from now. Dan Rather standing by at the White House to bring us up to the minute. Dan?
Walter, as you know, having been here all day, the rains came. Slow mizzle at first, then intermittent drizzle for most of the day. The rains have let up at this hour. So far as we can determine, the mood, the tone, the atmosphere, and what people say inside the White House, all of that still points to President Nixon at or about 9 p.m. Washington time this evening announcing his resignation. That has been the clear impression for about the past 24 hours at the White House. Very little to give an indication of any caution. But as reporters, we always, right up to the time someone does what has been indicated that he will do, exercise some caution. And in that spirit, I have to say that there are a few people inside the White House, close around President Nixon, who are still saying as of this hour, quote, I'll believe it when I hear it, which is to say they still believe it is possible that the president will, at the last moment, decide to remain in office and fight through a Senate trial, or some of them looking out windows and fiddling with pencils or pens in their hands will describe to you possibly stepping aside temporarily under the 25th Amendment. There are still people inside the White House saying that they believe that that may yet prove to be the case. But as we've been reporting all day, from all available indicators, at least on the surface, and from what the overwhelming majority of people around the president say, the president, at least as of this hour, plans to announce his resignation. There was that strange 35-minute period just a few minutes ago, stretching from roughly 6:20 this evening, Washington time, until about 6:50, possibly as late as 6:55, when the following situation occurred at the White House. I believe the situation is absolutely unique in the history of the White House. It certainly is unique in my experience in covering the White House. That reporters were not allowed to go into the White House grounds. Those reporters who were inside the White House were incarcerated in that small briefing room area and in their little broadcast hutches inside the White House for that long period. No explanation whatsoever as to what that was about. We do know that during that period, we know because we saw it happen, during that period, President Nixon walked briefly across the street from his small office in the Executive Office building, which is right next door to the White House, over to the White House itself. Now, what else was going on, no one knows, or at least those who know are not saying, because the president in the past has frequently done that. It was not unusual in the past for reporters to be held up for a minute or two while the White House officials guarded the president walking from one place to another. It may or may not be significant. It was one of the yet another strange thing that happened on this strange day in Washington. But what else is going on and what do we know? We're told by any number of staff members that the president does plan to announce his intentions tonight. As we've said before, an overwhelming majority of them also add they do expect him to resign. The president reached a tentative decision to resign on Monday. He took a cruise with his family Monday night aboard the yacht, the Sequoia on the Potomac. His daughters asked him to reconsider. He did, but he didn't change his mind. There was that family dinner upstairs in the White House last night in which some members of the family cried. The president did not. Speechwriters went to work last night on an address for, as some close to them put it, possible use in a resignation. The tentative plan, and everybody emphasizes that it is a tentative plan at the moment, but the contingency plan at the moment is as follows. For the president to make his intentions known tonight at 9 o'clock. The plan as of this hour, so far as can be determined, and emphasizing that it is a tentative contingency plan, is apparently for the president to announce his resignation effective sometime tomorrow. If indeed he goes through with that resignation, then Vice President Ford will be sworn in sometime around midday tomorrow. Walter?
And we'll be coming back to you, of course, frequently as this evening goes on. With me here in our studio is Eric Sevareid, who, like many newsmen, and I won't get personal about this, interrupted a vacation to get back here for this momentous day in Washington. Eric, quite a few members of Congress are demanding that the president admit his guilt in his speech tonight, and I'm wondering how much importance you place on that demand.
Well, I think the manner of his resignation and his whole tone and what he says probably is going to be pretty important as to what happens, not only in the Congress following this, but in the country at large, whether we have a big period of backlash, recriminations, and division or not. With Vice President Agnew last year, there was no further prosecution, as everybody knows, but part of that agreement was that he would agree to the publication of that 40-page indictment. That was regarded, I guess, as punishment enough, or at least they felt the record had to be clear. Now, there's nobody in the House who has the power, really, to grant him immunity from impeachment. There's no great stomach for it, of course. There have been two cases in the past, two federal judges who resigned before impeachment. The impeachment procedure was dropped, but there was a Secretary of War in the last century, about 100 years ago, I think, who resigned but was impeached anyway. He wasn't convicted, but he was impeached. Yes, there are many tag ends of this. There may be more evidence. We don't know who owns all this material, all the tapes and the rest of it. And what is concerning a lot of the lawyers in the House, and certainly the staff of the Judiciary Committee, is that you're acting here for the future as well as for the present terrible trouble we're in. There has to be some definite guide for future generations. So they feel, those people anyway, that the House must take some kind of formal action. Whether they by voice vote or something endorse the report, accept the report of the Judiciary Committee and the bill of impeachment, or just what they do. But it ought to be clear. It ought not be left, you know, in a cloud for the future. These things don't happen very often. So we will just have to wait and see what Mr. Nixon says.
And today there was a formal move at the Senate to, in a sense, to make it the sense of the Senate to grant immunity to the president, which admittedly they cannot legally do, but to simply say that it was the sense of the Senate that he should not be prosecuted in federal or state or local courts for any sins committed while he was in office. But the majority leader in the Senate, Mike Mansfield, and others came up right away and said that that was an unconscionable interference with the judicial branch of the government, and the Congress couldn't do that.
It wouldn't be legally constitutionally binding, that's for sure. There is the theory, of course, that he could pardon himself in advance, but to do that, or even for him to do any plea bargaining of any kind, now, it seems to me would degrade his departure. He is certainly going to do this with all the dignity he can summon. He must do that, and I'm sure he will. Then there's a question of these friends of his coming to trial a month from tomorrow. He could pardon them in advance, as I understand it. Whether he'd do that or not, we just have to wait and see. There are many angles to this that will be resolved maybe in the next hour or two.
I think it is noteworthy that in the last 2 or 3 of these sensational days, we have not had any positive indication of any kind that he has been plea bargaining on Capitol Hill or elsewhere.
No.
The only slight, tiniest kind of a clue, and it's not much, is that that Special Prosecutor Jaworski and his staff have been inaccessible to the press all day today, and that's unusual for them. But to read that plea bargain into that, I think, would be quite a stretch at this point. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout this evening, and I'll be back with more of this special report in a moment. This is the 2027th day of the Nixon presidency, that of the 37th President of the United States, and all the indications are that it is the last. His term, a normal term, would have 895 more days to run, and there's every indication that those days will be served out by his hand-picked Vice President, Gerald Ford, who came into office last December to replace Spiro Agnew after the elected Vice President had resigned from the office after pleading no contest to a felony charge of accepting kickbacks as a Maryland governor. This is a dramatic day. It's been dramatic from the very beginning this morning when Vice President Ford was first summoned to the White House, and it seemed so clear that this was the day. And the crowds have gathered outside the White House. It reminds some of us of those crowds outside the chanceries of Europe when governments were falling and when wars were impending, who stood throughout the night waiting for announcement of one kind or another. It's that kind of a picture outside the White House today, and Bob Schieffer has been there. He's now at Lafayette Park, right outside the White House. Bob?
Walter, one of the most unusual things about this unusual period, as you just mentioned, is that all week people have begun to just sort of gather outside the White House. People have come to the White House just behind us, stand near the gate there on Pennsylvania Avenue and across the street here at Lafayette Park. We're with some of them now. I'd like to just ask them, what's your name, sir?
Brian Davies.
Brian, why are you here and where are you from?
I'm from Parker, Indiana, from the Midwest. One of the reasons I came, I just want to see, you know, what actually was happening. Usually when you're set off into the Midwest, you know, you don't find out what's happening in Washington, D.C. So I came to Washington, D.C. and came to the White House to see what was happening tonight.
How do you feel about all this? Are you sad? Are you gloomy?
At first, you know, when you think of the President of the United States, you feel that, you know, someone like that, you hold them in high esteem and you feel that they shouldn't be impeached. But when you weigh all the odds and everything else and you find out what he has actually done and, you know, the Watergate situation, you just find out that, you know, the only way is an impeachment, and I believe it will help our economy and the United States will be better off.
And do you plan to stay out here through the night, or?
I'm going to stay as long until I find out what actually is going to happen, whether he's going to be impeached or whether he resigns tonight, or if need be, resign tomorrow.
How about you, gentlemen? Are you from out of town?
Yes, sir. I'm from Houston, Texas.
What, are you just here on a visit, or?
No, I'm up here on business.
I see. How did you happen to come down to the White House?
Well, I was staying right next door here in a hotel, and so I just walked on down. I knew there'd be a lot of activity. I saw some specials on the TV set in the room.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about all of this?
Well, I feel sort of sorry for President Nixon at this time. I think, though, that probably he's decided that it's probably for the better of the country that he stepped down, because I don't think he can be an effective leader anymore. Even if he wouldn't resign, I don't see how he could be an effective leader. And I'd say the country probably is in need of some effective leadership now, especially in the economy.
How about this gentleman back here? Are you from out of town, sir?
Well, I live here. I'm a student at George Washington University, engineering school.
Were you, did you just come down just a few moments ago, or have you been here for a while? Or?
We've been here just a few minutes. We came down to see if anybody that was going to be here tonight, if we were going to get a chance to see them. But I don't know if it's an exciting time, but it certainly is memorable. I'm sure this is going to be with me forever. So it's kind of a strange thing. I think he should have possibly done this a couple of years ago. I think it would have been much better for the country if he'd have done this.
Plan to stay out here for a while, or?
Probably a little longer.
I see. Walter, this applause you hear, what has happened is that a moving van has just pulled up over at the White House. It may just be that the van is going down Pennsylvania Avenue, but at any rate, it pulled up here, and some of the people in this crowd began to applaud when it did. That's about the story here. Several hundred people still here, Walter. They've been here, or crowds about this size, through the week as this thing began to build.
Much of the president's seventh crisis, he wrote a book, you know, some years ago about his 6 crises. Well, this certainly, if not the 7th, if it's a higher number than that, it is the greatest crisis of his career, and much of it has been centered on Capitol Hill. Since the Watergate burglary 2 years and 2 months ago, on June 17th, 1972, the highlights of the revelations of the Watergate affair and the associated events have all come from Capitol Hill, or most of them. There was a Senate Watergate hearing last summer. For the first time, the public heard confirmation of the newspaper stories of the extent of the White House involvement. And then just 10 days ago, the House Judiciary Committee, for only the second time in our history, voted to recommend to the House of Representatives impeachment of a president after several days of open hearings seen on the nation's television sets in which much of the evidence was recounted again. So it's appropriate to go up to Capitol Hill right now and to learn from George Herman something of the mood up there on this historic night. George?
Well, Walter, the latest thing that happened, of course, was the Republican conference in the Senate, a meeting of the Republican senators. They met for about half an hour, and they emerged, I'd have to say, grim and depressed, some of them stony-faced, some of them looking extremely sad. Peter Domenici of New Mexico said to me, "It's a very sad time," and then he excused himself and left. They were told that the swearing-in of Gerald Ford would take place at noon at the White House and that there was no role for the Republican leadership. They are not involved in that. Some of their discussion was about scheduling matters, but other parts of the discussion were about something which they considered more serious and more important, and that is Senator Brooks' resolution, which he entered into the Senate today, a joint resolution, he hopes, which expresses the desire of Congress, the sense of the Congress, that there should be no further prosecution of the president after his resignation. And during the course of the meeting, Marlowe Cook of Kentucky said he would like to join Senator Brooke in proposing that motion. He said, "We cannot have reconciliation in this country. We cannot heal the wounds unless we free the president from the prospect of being tried, being put in jail." And Cook shook his head and said, "The prospect of a president, even a former president, in jail," and he just shook his head and said, "We have to do something to protect him from that." He said he felt that the American people were perhaps more forgiving than Washington and the members of the Congress, and that's what they want. He said, as a matter of fact, that all day long people have been calling his office, some of them weeping on the telephone and saying the president should not be impeached, should not resign, should stay on in office. He said it's a terrible time, and we have to do what we can to try to bring back some mood of reconciliation, to heal the wounds. We've got to get it over with, he said. We cannot keep going on and on. And Senator Javits added a further dimension to that when he said it's the job of the Congress to isolate the president from the Watergate problems, and I took him to mean by that it's the job of the Congress to isolate the new president, Jerry Ford, he said. It's the job of the Congress to isolate the new president from the problem of the decision of having to decide, should he grant clemency, should he make decisions, should he call off the special prosecutor, should he try to have the executive branch call off any further investigations, any further prosecutions of the president and the people around him. And Javits seemed to think that Congress should perhaps take that off of Jerry Ford's hands, make the decision itself, and settle it for him. Now, a number of the senators, a number of the members of the House are spending this evening in their offices. They're going to watch the president on television in their offices, then they're going to consult with each other, and some of them said that they would then make themselves available to comment after they have seen and heard what the president has to say. Before, they simply wanted to go be alone, express their sadness to us, but they wanted to be alone, basically. They did not want to talk. And most of the newsmen here, in fact, all of the newsmen here, respected that, asked them a few questions, and let them go. That's about the situation on the Hill now. It's just like the rest of the country, Walter. Everybody is just waiting.
There has been apparently, George, as you report from the Hill, quite an outpouring of sentiment for the president, some of it quite emotional. We had on our CBS Evening News a little while ago a filmed report from the White House where volunteers were receiving up to 500 calls an hour in support of the president. They said 99% of them were, some of them quite emotional. Rabbi Korp, the head of the committee to defend the presidency, something of that kind. That may not be the exact title. A couple of days ago called for such an outpouring of sentiment that he hoped at that time might persuade the president to remain in office, and apparently they are coming in to some extent. After all, there were 47 million Americans who voted for President Nixon in 1968. The most recent Harris and Gallup polls have indicated that roughly a fourth of them still support him. So that means that there's a support factor out there of something around 12 to 15 million persons, apparently. And some of those are getting on the telephone and sending telegrams tonight. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout this evening, and I'll be back with more of this special report in a moment. Reported to us on the general mood up on Capitol Hill. Well, one influential Republican is Senator Charles Percy of Illinois. If the president resigns tonight as anticipated at 9 o'clock and Vice President Ford becomes the 38th president, Senator Percy has been mentioned as a possible choice for vice president. He's here in our Washington studio right now with Roger Mudd.
Yes, sir. Just to start off, Senator, I take it that if Mr. Ford asks you to become his vice president, you would accept that?
Of course, and I have every reason to believe every other single person on any list he may have would accept readily. I can't imagine any American turning him down now for any post that he should ask them to undertake to help bring this country together again.
You were in the 6 o'clock conference up on the Hill that Herman reported on. Who led that meeting, Senator? Scott?
That was a conference that was led by Norris Cotton, who is the conference chairman, but Senator Scott spoke, but a great many other senators spoke.
Did Senator Scott describe the meeting that he and Barry Goldwater and John Rhodes had with the president yesterday?
Yes, he did. I had talked with him last night, and he gave a full report, very comparable to what he told me last night.
What did he say about it?
He indicated that the meeting was forthright, that he carried out the wishes of the Republican Policy Committee the day before, that the president be frankly and fully appraised of the situation that he would face in the Senate. He was well aware of the situation in the House. It was a candid, straightforward meeting among really old, long-established, long-time friends.
Did the president yesterday tell the three representatives of the Congress that he was indeed going to resign?
No, he did not, to the best of my knowledge.
When do you understand he made that decision, Senator?
I think he probably made it very shortly after that meeting. That was the final bit of evidence that he needed, and he assured the men present, and Barry Goldwater reported last night, that the president would make that decision based on what was in the national interest.
Senator, as we look forward to the president's appearance this evening, what would you like to have the president say?
Well, of course, we know what he's going to say, that his resignation is effective immediately. And certainly we anticipate that the swearing-in will be at 12 noon tomorrow in the Oval Office, but President Ford will take effect and have the power of the presidency as of the moment of the president's resignation, which would be executed by a delivery of a letter to Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State. I really do not know what I would want the president to say. I do feel that there is a duty and an obligation to put out as much of the truth of Watergate as we can voluntarily, so that no more has to be extracted, that it can all be laid on the table, so that judgments can be rendered and it can be gotten swiftly behind us, and President Ford would not be encumbered with a hangover, you might say, of Watergate, because he will have many, many pressing problems that we'll want to work with him on to resolve.
But would you have the president embrace a degree of guilt and responsibility and culpability for Watergate?
I would hope the president would assume that degree of responsibility that he forthrightly and truthfully should and must assume. I think that is the quickest way to get behind it. It is what I have urged for 2 years. Barry Goldwater has urged it. I suppose it is late now, but it's better now than to never be done, and it should come directly from the president. That would certainly help clarify the role that others had played then, and it would make a vast difference if they actually operated in some of the things that were done someplace along the line under instructions and orders from the president. And having made this decision now, this is probably the most difficult part of the president's decision as to what really to say tonight. I do not expect it to be a long speech, though.
Senator, if he says that, and if he says, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, I am guilty of impeachable offenses, would there be then a climate in the Congress to pass a resolution that would give the president immunity from civil or criminal proceedings against him, or could the Congress even do that?
We recognize we do not have the legal authority to do that. We can pass a sense of the Senate and House resolution that would help the special Watergate prosecutor, but Leon Jaworski has the responsibility and the authority and the power, just as President Ford would have the power to pardon anyone for any offenses that were committed. But we would want to work together on this, and to a great extent it would help immeasurably if the president voluntarily laid it all out so that we could fully understand the reasons why this Watergate was undertaken in the first place and what happened as to why the cover-up continued so long.
Senator, earlier today on the Hill, when reporters talked to you, you raised the question of whether a president who had, in effect, brought some dishonor or discredit on the office should be given all the emoluments, the perks of being an ex-president that he's entitled to. Do you think that in the case of Richard Nixon, he should be denied the use of government jets and embassies and secretarial staffs and so forth?
I am assuming now that there is going to be some form of compassion and understanding, and certainly no vindictiveness by the country. None of us feel vindictive about this, so that I assume a great deal would be done by us to heal the wounds now. The question is a matter of propriety then, as to whether the president should enjoy all of the emoluments of being an ex-president when they were designed and part of them instituted by him. The office building built for or constructed and furbished for ex-presidents. He would be the only one using it. Secretarial assistants, franking services, the use of government jets, limousines, the services of all of the embassies around the world. Would it be appropriate and right for those to go to a president that was, by his own action and word, forced to resign? Is it appropriate? And I think we must reappraise and reanalyze that, and I think we'll all do a great deal of searching to do the right thing so that there is fairness and justice, because we must take into account certainly the fine family, the Nixon family that has stood by their husband and father, and we pay great tribute to them for so doing. But we must remember also there are men serving sentences in jail because of Watergate. We know their wives, we know their children. Many of us have known them for years, and they are paying a bitter price. Would it be then fair to have everything go on as if nothing had happened and President Nixon be dealt with only as any other ex-president would? Those are moral questions we're seeking guidance and counsel on. We called Father Hesburgh. I'm talking to others, and I would hope men like John Gardner and others who are above partisan politics could help us in finding the right course for this nation to take in all of these matters.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Percy of Illinois. Walter?
There's a countdown of sorts on tonight, a countdown toward the expected end of the Nixon presidency, and it is expected now to come an hour and a half from now when the president appears before the nation on television with his address to the people, and that is expected to be his resignation. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout the evening, and this special report will resume after station identification. Are awaiting the decision of Richard Milhouse Nixon as to the fate of the 37th presidency of the United States, and by all reports today, it will be the end of that presidency when he goes on the air tonight at 9 o'clock, a little less than an hour and a half from now, with what is expected to be his resignation speech. Dan Rather has been covering the details of this day at the White House, and he's there now, as he will be through the evening. Dan?
Walter, this is an add-on to a story that we began telling about an hour ago. It is the story of that period earlier this evening between 6:20 and about 6:50 or 6:55, when the White House had a very tight security lid on and reporters were not allowed into the White House or not allowed any movement inside the White House whatsoever. What we described earlier as a unique period. We now have an explanation of that by White House officials, plus an apology to all reporters concerned. This apparently is what happened. You may recall that we described President Nixon during that period leaving his small office suite next door to the White House in the Executive Office building and walking across what's known as Executive Avenue between the so-called EOB and the White House itself. Now, what happened is the president, who had been working in his small so-called hideaway office in the Executive Office building, called the White House Protection Agency and the Secret Service and said, "I'd like a few moments with myself. If you don't mind, could you," this is a paraphrase, in effect, "could you make sure that I have a chance to walk from my office over to the mansion by myself?" That's precisely what was going on during that period. It apparently took so long because, as has been the case throughout this whole period of the last several days, when there's been so much pressure on so many people in the White House, the bureaucracy there is slow to move and moves cautiously. And what you had here were police and Secret Service men who wanted to give the President of the United States those few moments alone, as he had requested. That is what happened. A spokesman for the White House press office apologized for any inconvenience that it may have caused anyone. Also, Walter, within the past few moments, the leaders of Congress have begun arriving at the White House for the talk with President Nixon. The president spent some time with his family upstairs in the White House, in the mansion, as it is called, and now he is either doing or just about to do the briefing for the congressional leaders. Senator Eastland was seen going in, Senator Scott, Representative John Rhodes, and others.
This meeting, of course, is not intended in any way to change his mind at this late minute. It is the normal presidential courtesy to the Congress in informing them before he advises the populace as a whole. Is that not right?
Exactly, Walter. And one of the things that President Nixon and his staff have made very clear over the past 24 hours, and I think when the history of this period is written, that it's going to become even clearer than it is now, is their absolute determination to make a smooth transfer of power, if indeed there is to be one. President Nixon, who, for whatever else one may or may not say about him, is a close student of history and a reader of history, has said several times in the past privately that one of the ways you judge society, one of the ways you judge a republic, a nation, a country, is how well it makes the transfer of power, particularly under times of stress. No one would argue that this strange time is in many ways a time of stress, and the president and the people around him are absolutely determined to show this country, but more importantly show the world, that again, when necessary, the United States, if necessary, can make a smooth transition of power. And symbolically, that is precisely what this meeting that is going on this hour is all about. The President of the United States informing the leaders of the elected representatives of this country as to precisely what his intentions are before he tells the world at large.
We've been told, Dan, that Vice President Ford has actually been working on this transition since Monday afternoon, that he became convinced on Monday when the Senate Minority Whip, Senator Griffin of his home state of Michigan, announced that he could no longer support the president and called for his resignation, that even before the president released that last transcripts of the meeting 6 days after the Watergate, when it became clear through those transcripts that he had indeed attempted to obstruct justice, and in fact the admission of guilt to one of the charges in the first article of impeachment passed by the House committee. When that happened, Ford apparently was convinced and began going to work at that moment on the transition. And from his office today, where he was closeted for 2 hours this afternoon with the Secretary of State, Dr. Kissinger, on foreign policy matters. We have learned from some of his staff that the series of events that, as he anticipates them, will be, first of all, a speech calling for unity and conciliation among the American people, praising probably President Nixon's courage, which Vice President Ford thinks very highly of. That speech, perhaps to the American people, and we've heard he may ask for television time tomorrow night to make the speech actually from the East Room of the White House. He may also go before a joint session of Congress to make much the same appeal and to some way outline his domestic and foreign program. That, incidentally, is expected to be very much the same as President Nixon's has been. He will ask the cabinet officers to stay on and much of the White House staff to stay on at least temporarily. We've been advised that Henry Kissinger will certainly stay on as Secretary of State. A well-placed source said that tonight in Washington here. He'll begin moving the intimate the White House staff probably in over a period of weeks, I guess, Dan. That usually takes a little while, even as when Johnson took over from the assassinated President Kennedy. He didn't throw everybody out right away, but within a few months, why the transition had taken place, and there were a few of the Kennedy White House staff left.
Walter, exactly so, and it has already been made clear by Vice President Ford to certain members of the White House staff that he wants them to stay on for at least the transition period. For example, Chief of White House Staff General Alexander Haig is one of those that the Vice President has made clear that he wants him to stay on for at least a short period. That is not to say that he may not choose to have him stay on longer. There are any number of people in the White House who are not visible, whose names are not known, the loyal White House Guard, those who make up, in some cases, civil service people, but others in appointed positions who stay over from administration to administration. For example, I'm thinking in particular of one young woman who has been a secretary in the White House through the Johnson years and all through the Nixon years. It may be worth pointing out, Walter, how many of these people, good, decent people, apolitical in the sense that they work for the government of the United States, not for any party, who keep the government going and indeed keep the White House going through periods such as this.
And we've also heard that Vice President Ford is more likely to depend on a cabinet-type government. His cabinet members having much more responsibility and freedom of action than President Nixon has permitted his cabinet. More of a staff organization similar to that General Eisenhower had in his administration. And we've also been told that he considers the number one priority, which I don't suppose it takes anybody very much to figure out, is inflation and the economy. And I assume that in his early speeches he will certainly tackle that issue and try to get the country behind it, that he expects to try to jawbone us into a slowdown of the inflation rate at any rate, trying to get business and labor to hold the line on wages and prices. One issue raised by Watergate is, of course, that of presidential power. And historian Richard Neustadt has thought about that. He's in New York now with Mike Wallace.
Professor Neustadt has been called a scholar in the corridors of power. He was the first director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard, the John F. Kennedy Institute of Politics. He is author of Presidential Power, The Politics of Leadership. And when he was a teenager, he is quoted as saying that in Washington, his dad worked for the New Deal, and he said the government, that is, young Dick Neustadt said, the government was so decent and honorable that it seemed to me a halo was visible over the White House at dusk. You said that.
Oh, yes, I said that.
And now you write that the presidency has lost credibility under Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Why? Because of Vietnam and because of Watergate, or does it go deeper than that, Professor Neustadt?
It goes, I'm afraid, to their operating styles, the styles of those two people, and maybe to character deficiencies behind them. I can't be sure.
Specify.
Each tried, Mr. Johnson with the war, Mr. Nixon with a great many things we now know a great deal about. Each tried to, in a way, to undertake cover-up, to undertake deception. Each lost credibility. Each created what we've come to call a credibility gap. Mr. Johnson, out of what may have been a praiseworthy desire to have a big war and at the same time keep his great society, did not was not straightforward with Congress, with his own budget bureau, his own Council of Economic Advisors, his own officials, about the duration of the war he'd decided to fight or how he planned to fight it. And over time, the lack of candor in those regards virtually destroyed him, destroyed his usefulness.
And with Richard Nixon?
With Richard Nixon, the adoption of a stance of which his own conduct, once exposed, ripped apart, has equally destroyed his credit along with his credibility.
You have written that the presidential power is the power to persuade. And apparently Richard Nixon has realized that in the last week or 10 days, has realized that himself, that he's lost his power because he has lost the ability to go to the American people, to go to the American Congress and persuade it.
Even to his own bureaucracy, to the press, to all the labor unions and all the officials of private organizations who he wants to hold down prices. He has no persuasive power left.
Well, then, are you saying that it is not the institution of the presidency that has gotten too big, too unwieldy, too difficult to handle, but you're really talking to the occupants of the White House, the last two occupants of the White House, Johnson, Nixon, who have, in effect, misled, lied, been less than candid with their colleagues and with the American people?
The office may be terribly too much for any man, but men have had to cope with it before and will again. These two men, unfortunately, conducted themselves in such a way as to hurt the office.
Men like Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and indeed Henry Kissinger, did they have too much power delegated to them by Richard Nixon?
In my view, Haldeman and Ehrlichman certainly had too much power delegated to them. Mr. Haldeman had power delegated to him. A White House staff man who has no responsibility to Congress is supposed to have no independent power. Mr. Haldeman had delegated to him, it appears, complete power over the president's schedule, the president's appointments, whom he saw, when he saw them. And Mr. Ehrlichman had delegated to him authority to run an unauthorized, illegal, little baby bitty Gestapo in the White House itself.
Well, by the same token, do you disagree with the power that was delegated to Henry Kissinger by the president? Or do we misapprehend the amount of power delegated to Kissinger by Mr. Nixon?
When Mr. Kissinger operated as Special Assistant or Assistant for National Security Affairs, he operated in part as head of a highly organized staff that was connected with a cabinet committee. For the rest, when he was doing personal missions for the president, as in the China case, he was clearly doing a piece of personal presidential business for the president, constantly reporting to the president. And as Secretary of State, of course, he is independently responsible to Congress. I see a great difference there.
A final question to you for now, Professor Neustadt, and I know that you'll be here during the course of the evening, and I hope that we'll get a chance to talk with you again. Bigness has invaded the presidency ever since the days of the New Deal, and it seemed that more and more power was flowing to the presidency. Now, in just the last month, let us say, one senses that perhaps power is beginning to shift back. In the case of the impeachment proceedings in the House, in the case of the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court about the 64 tapes. Is this just a momentary bump on a road downhill?
I don't believe that so much power really shifted to the presidency in the first place. The last two presidents have both been forced to resign for lack of public support and congressional support. I do think that what has happened in the last few weeks has a very good effect. It will force the next several presidents to be much more careful of their congressional relations, their relations with officials, their relations with the public and the press than Mr. Nixon was. But that restores checks and balances.
The question is, do we have to go through the agonies of Vietnam and the agonies of Watergate in order for the system to right itself? And both were agonies.
Both were agonies. We have had actually to go through both. I regard those two things as related much more to the men who happen to be president than I do to institutions. I don't think that the institution required men who had these particular problems. And I think you'll find out as the presidency goes on that it's possible to operate it in a more open fashion, on a more responsible fashion than Mr. Nixon seems to have been able to do.
Thank you very much, Professor Richard Neustadt, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to talk with you again after the President's speech this evening. Walter?
Our CBS News coverage continues throughout the evening, and we'll be back with more of this special report in a moment. The people of America, of course, are standing by for President Nixon's announcement at 9 o'clock tonight, which is expected to be an announcement that he is resigning as the 37th president and that Vice President Gerald Ford is coming in as the 38th president. The people are following these events all across America and around the world, for that matter. And we'll go to one of those places where people are following events in Herald Square in New York City, where Robert Shackney is standing by. Bob?
This is the kind of crowd, Walter, that you'd normally see on a Thursday night in Herald Square when the big department stores stay open so late. A good many people say they intend to be home early. They'd like to hear the president. The interest is high. The immediate crowd that's right around me is more attracted, I think, by the television equipment than they are by the events that are taking place in Washington. Still, people we've talked to say they do care about what's happening. They say that most people, in a very unscientific sampling, say they think the president should resign. Some people say they think he should be impeached and convicted. There are those who say that he's no different from anyone else, that if he committed a crime, he should be punished. You do find cynics in New York, people who say President Nixon has done nothing different than other politicians have done. You do find some defenders of the president who say he shouldn't resign. One policeman told me he shouldn't resign. Another woman told me he shouldn't resign. But I think the sense of this crowd and this intersection in New York, a downtown intersection, is that it's time for President Nixon to go. Walter?
For the mood elsewhere in the country, Bill Plant is in Chicago.
Walter, I guess you could say that this is heartland America. It's actually DuPage County, just west of Chicago, which is one of the wealthiest suburban districts in the nation, also one of the most politically conservative. The DuPage County voters gave Richard Nixon a 75% plurality in 1972, and that's the same that they gave him in Orange County, California. And we're in the television section of a large department store, as you can see, and there's some traffic through here, although it's a little early for the shoppers this evening. Some people stopping to watch what's going on television, indicating some interest in what the president has to say later. But we've gotten some comments from people who've gone by. It's too bad, said one man, that the president had to be cornered. Another one said he had poor advice. And a woman said that she thought he'd been guilty, but that she wishes he'd gone through a Senate trial. Another one, perhaps a cynic, said, well, it's the safe way. At least he can get his pension. But no one so far in our very random and very unscientific survey has expressed a desire that Richard Nixon remain in office. And this is, as we say, sort of silent majority country. It is, after all, a conservative district, one which voted overwhelmingly for Richard Nixon in 1972. We'll be staying here to talk to these folks as they stop and watch the speech a little bit later on. Walter?
Well, the possibility of the resignation of President Nixon became seriously considered as of Monday evening when many of his strongest supporters on Capitol Hill began to desert him after the publication of those 3 transcripts of his June 23rd, 1972 conversations with H.R. Bob Haldeman, the ones that indicated he had indeed known of Watergate at that early time, 6 days after the break-in, and had suggested that the CIA be brought in to try to call off the FBI investigation. In other words, an admission that he perhaps did obstruct justice, as the House Judiciary Committee charged him in the first article of impeachment they voted out 10 days ago. Since that time, the move toward this night has seemed to be inexorable. And of course, one of those persons most seriously involved is the Vice President of the United States, Gerald Ford, who will become the president upon President Nixon's resignation. Bruce Morton is with friends and colleagues of Gerald Ford now. Bruce?
Walter, it's funny, I suppose, to say that somebody like a Vice President of the United States isn't enormously well known to everybody, but Gerald Ford spent most of his political life in the Congress. Congressmen tend to be well known in their district and in this city, but not necessarily to the rest of the country. So to talk a little bit about what kind of a man the Vice President is, we've asked 3 of his former colleagues in the House to be here with us. Sitting next to me, Don Regal, now a Democrat from Michigan, formerly a Republican from Michigan. Next to him, Martha Griffiths, a Democrat from Michigan. And furthest away, Albert Quie, a Republican from Minnesota. Mr. Quie, if I may start with you, and I hope you'll all just feel free to join in. You, I know, have known Mr. Ford a long time. You are part of a Wednesday prayer group that meets, that includes him. If you were describing him to a stranger, what kind of a man is Gerald Ford?
Well, I'd say he's an open, decent person. He's open in that I've observed him willing to listen to all sides. You know, we have quite a difference in the political philosophy on the Republican side. Don Regal, as you indicated, used to be a Republican, and at that time, Jerry Ford would listen to the most conservative, and he'd listen to the most liberal. He'd listen to Don. I believe Don would feel that he never ostracized him for any stand he took in that way. In this way, Jerry got the feel of the cross-section. Another thing I'd say about decent is that he was investigated by 350 FBI agents. You know, there's no politician's been investigated as thoroughly as Jerry Ford, and then he was cleared by both the House and the Senate. The House, for the first time, under the 25th Amendment, had this advise and consent responsibility. And so that gives you an indication. But there's some other things about him, too. He's got tremendous courage, because at the time when he ran in 1965 for minority leader, that took some courage, and he just won by a 3-vote margin, so it wasn't a sure thing for him. And I think the American people would be happy to know that the person is of that ability as well. I have some other things I could say about him too, but I'd say that most quickly to them.
Ms. Griffiths?
Well, I'm sure that's true, that after this night, when the President speaks, the American people will believe him. He is absolutely honest. But in addition to that, in addition to listening to everyone, he has a wonderful home life. I think one of the really interesting things about him is that one of his children has become a member of the religious, and I think that's really remarkable, because I think that bespeaks a good home. In addition, his children they go with him every year out to Aspen at Christmas time to ski. And one of his sons said rather irreverently, he'll ski right up to the cemetery. I think that's really very nice.
You know, I would add just to what you said earlier, Al, that and I agree with the things you said, that also that Jerry is a kind person. I don't think it's part of his makeup to be someone who could be vindictive or mean-spirited or cruel. I mean, he's just not that kind of person. And I think not only was he willing to listen to different points of view, but I think he went out of his way to protect, if you will, dissenters within the Republican Party. I know he did that in the case of Pete McCloskey, and I recall that when I was supporting Pete in his challenge to President Nixon back in the New Hampshire primary in 1972, that 2 weeks before that primary, Jerry Ford came into my district where I was under some pressure from local Republicans to support the president. And Jerry supported me and said that he thought I ought to be reelected. He didn't agree with my challenge at that time, but he thought that it was proper for a Republican to be able to do that. But I think that kind of tolerance for difference, which the country has missed in recent years, is something that I think he can help reestablish. And I think at this time, I mean, none of us have all the right ideas, but to encourage, as he will, people to express themselves and to stand for what they believe in, I just think is a terribly important quality that he has.
And his tolerance for difference isn't indifference. You know, there's an awful lot of people that are tolerant for difference and they're just indifferent and don't care. Yeah. But one thing I noticed about him is that he could really get to the heart of the issue. Now, I could talk with him about an education matter or a labor matter or a poverty matter and go into the details of the legislation, talk about what are really the controversial parts of it, and he could talk about that and be aware of it. And John Burns, who was then then ranking on Ways and Means, could come up and talk to him about a tax measure, and he'd be immediately into a conversation with him. You know, a quick grasp and a grasp and depth of that. And so he would listen, but he could come to a decision very easily.
In addition to that, he is going to listen to what is happening to the people in the country, and he is going to pay attention to the economic situation in the country. He will understand it. He will be willing to be briefed in case the pound floats or the lira is in trouble.
I guess you people in Michigan know how he listened to people, because he was the first one I heard of. I think a lot of young congressmen who came in the time I did the 85th Congress learned from him. He took that house trailer and went around to all the communities in his district. Or
I ran a trailer like that, and all of them then did that too.
Yeah,
right.
The young people came in at my time listened to Jerry, and I imagine some on your side have done that. So that's the way he is, open to people.
You know, the one thing, lest the people who are watching think that he's absolutely perfect and doesn't have any flaws or things to worry about. One of the things that I think that also marks Jerry is the fact that he's been, as a party leader, he's been thrust into a role of being more partisan rather than less so. And I think some of us who respect him very much and who like him as a friend hope that in stepping up to the presidency, as we assume that he will, that he'll do that in the least partisan way, in the sense of reaching out to the whole country. And that isn't to say that there aren't party responsibilities that he'll have and should respond to, but that I certainly hope that there won't be an excess of partisanship, but I think that's something that will involve, to some extent, a change from the role that Jerry had to be in when he was the minority leader in the House, and particularly when there was a Republican president, the White House had to, or felt obligated to fight for a partisan point of view. I think he can rise above that, and I certainly hope he will.
Well, I think he did in the House, too, because, you know, he stuck up for the side of the minority. But everybody knows the friendship that Speaker Albert has for Jerry Ford and Majority Leader Tip O'Neill. Now, that comes from respect. And they got that tremendous respect for him. I think indicates the kind of leader he is.
Mr. Quee, Ms. Griffiths, Mr. Regal, thank you very much. Walter?
Our CBS News coverage continues throughout this evening, and this special report will resume after station identification. The United States President is moving toward resignation, and the announcement of that is expected to come 1 hour from now at 9 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time this evening, when President Nixon takes to television and radio to announce his decision to the American people. The day began this morning with the first indications that this was the fateful day when the President summoned to his Oval Office the Vice President, Gerald Ford, and spent 1 hour and 10 minutes in private conversation with him. Shortly thereafter, around noon, the newsmen at the White House were briefed that the President would go on the air tonight at 9 o'clock, and that, of course, fed the rumors and reports that he was going to resign. Shortly after that, the leader of the minority on the House side in Capitol Hill, John Rhodes, said that the President would resign this afternoon, the first positive word, and within minutes after that, White House aides were telling newsmen at the White House the same thing. Now we know that the President's plans are, after his speech tonight, to leave the White House tomorrow morning and fly to his home in San Clemente, California. And Vice President Ford will, shortly after the resignation is handed, as the law demands, to the Secretary of State, Dr. Kissinger, Mr. Ford will take the oath of office. And it is expected that he will go on the air tomorrow night, probably from the White House itself. Dan Rather is at the White House. Dan, is there anything new in the last half hour since we last talked to you?
A couple of things, Walter. One thing, the mood of the crowd here across the street from the White House remains one of principally a crowd without joy. There are a few people in the crowd attempting to get attention drawn to themselves, but generally it's a quiet crowd. Another thing I think that is important to point out is that President Nixon, in his briefing for congressional leaders this evening, it now turns out that he is doing not one briefing, but at least 2 briefings. You will recall that congressional leaders were invited to the White House to be at the White House about 7:30 Washington time this evening to begin a briefing by the President on exactly what his intentions are in his nationally broadcast address tonight. One of those meetings, we are now told, a meeting that included, among others, Senator Scott, Representative Rhodes, lasted from approximately 7:30 until about 7:48 or 7:50. Then we are told another meeting between the President and some other leaders of Congress began. This was described to us as the President's way of making these briefing sessions as personal as possible. Many of these men that he is briefing tonight in this strange atmosphere and a strained atmosphere, certainly for the President, nearly unbearable strain, whatever his announcement turns out to be. The President wanted it to be as personal a moment as he could make it with the various leaders of Congress, so he's having at least 2 briefings and possibly more, breaking the groups into 2 smaller groups, breaking them into groups, rather than doing it as one large crowd. Another is a report that we have not had an opportunity to check thoroughly. However, we have been told by 2 sources who in the past have been reliable that the following will be the case. That News Secretary Ronald Ziegler will go with President Nixon to California tomorrow and will stay with President Nixon. That Vice President Ford, who has already indicated that he wants to keep some of the White House staff people around for at least a while during a transitional period, if not for longer, that Vice President Ford already has selected his new news secretary, and we are told that that new news secretary will be Jerry Terhorst, a Detroit newspaperman, career professional journalist. Mr. Terhorst, who has been one of the White House regulars, one of the White House press corps regulars over many years, one of the better-known journalists in Washington, was previously asked to be the Vice President's press secretary when Mr. Ford came into office. Mr. Terhorst had known Representative Ford for many years, covering him as a representative from a Michigan district. Terhorst turned it down. We are now told, although we have not had an opportunity to talk to Jerry Terhorst himself, that Mr. Terhorst has agreed to become the new secretary to Mr. Ford. This is on the assumption that Mr. Ford, by sometime late tomorrow, will have been sworn in as the new President of the United States. Walter, we would like to add once again that cautionary note, although we're now inside the final hour, that while no solid indicators can be found anywhere that the President intends to do anything except resign tonight, that there are 1 or 2 people close to the President inside the White House who are still shaking their heads, saying, "I'll believe it when I hear it." Walter?
Well, no solid indicators that he's going to do anything other than resign, but an awful lot of indicators that he is going to resign, including the announcement from John Rhodes himself earlier today, and the White House aides, and a lot of others. Vice President Ford's activities during the day certainly indicate he's expecting to take over. You say yourself that he's appointed his press secretary for the White House, and President Nixon is planning to leave tomorrow morning. By the way, Dan, one of the press services says that he's going on just one of the White House VIP planes and not on Air Force One, the President's own plane. Is that correct?
Well, the the original plan was to offer the President Air Force One, what he likes to call the Spirit of 76. Now, apparently what has happened is the President has indicated that while he would like to have government transportation out, that he believes that Air Force One, the Spirit of 76, should remain here at the new President's disposal. That apparently is what has happened. Walter, there is one other indicator that the President does indeed intend to announce his resignation, or at least leave the White House. We mentioned earlier, but I would like to mention it again, in that their service to their country and to the President has been so thorough and so loyal that Manolo and Fina Sanchez, the Nixon's longtime personal family servants, were seen this afternoon loading what appeared to be some household effects into automobiles.
I assume that that moving van that we saw out in front of the White House a little earlier this evening had nothing to do with the
No, Walter, I think that was a publicity stunt.
It very well could be. Phil Jones reports, Dan, that the swearing in of Mr. Ford, Phil Jones is our CBS newsman, has been reporting on the vice presidential activities. He reports that the swearing in of Mr. Ford will take place tomorrow, weather permitting, at noon in the Rose Garden, right off of the Oval Office at the White House, otherwise in the Oval Office itself, and that Chief Justice Berger will officiate, although we understood earlier today that Mr. Berger was out of the country, or at least out of town, but perhaps they are getting him back for that occasion tomorrow. You know, throughout this rather sad occasion, one of the silver linings that is frequently mentioned by observers of the presidency and the workings of the American government has been that at least this whole process over the 2 years since the Watergate burglary has proved that the system works, that despite the views the full power of the presidency being used to attempt a cover-up of the events at the Watergate. The system has uncovered it and has brought us to this point in time. Part of the system, of course, is that part which is the voice of the people expressing themselves not only through their congressmen, but through organizations set up for the purpose of organizing the voice of the people. And one of those is Common Cause. Its head is John Gardner, and Roger Mudd is with him now.
Before Mr. Gardner became head of Common Cause, he was the Secretary for Health, Education, and Welfare under the Johnson administration. Before that, he was president of the Carnegie Foundation. Mr. Gardner has indicated he would like to talk this evening briefly about the future of the country and its administration and what lessons it should have learned from Watergate. May I ask, by way of beginning, Mr. Gardner, what comment you would make on the fact that Mr. Ford's apparent first appointment was that of a press secretary?
Well, I think it's very appropriate. It's a perfect reflection of the power of your profession, Roger. And if the president resigns, every sensible American will of course, wish the new president great success. It's the safety and economy of our economy and our country. But we also have to face the fact that recent events have raised very large questions in the public mind, questions that go to the heart of our political philosophy, questions that really won't be put back in the box now that they're out, such as what kind of country we want to be, how powerful the president should be, whether we can call the president to account, whether we have access to our own government, whether our own instruments of self-government can be used to coerce us. These are very serious questions, and they cannot be answered by gestures of goodwill or openness. They're going to have to be answered by concrete acts. For example, very shortly, Congress will send up to the White House a bill for the public financing of presidential campaigns. Mr. Nixon said that he would veto such a bill. If Mr. Ford were to sign it, it would be the first sign that he intends to clean up the political process. He could, by his own act, do much to clean up the lobbying mess that exists in the executive branch. He could issue an executive order which would, in effect, require every official to log and make public every contact with lobbyists. He could, one after another, clear up these questions of openness through concrete acts. For example, he could ask both parties to sit down and draw up legislation to outlaw subversion of the political process. Well, these are the things that I think we should be watching for. Sharp, concrete signs that the president intends to open up the government.
Mr. Gardner, by raising the question of presidential accountability, do you mean to suggest that Richard Nixon has not been accountable to the people?
Well, I think that for a good many years, the whole process of power in Washington has been losing the attribute of accountability simply because of the hugeness and complexity, the inability of people to have a voice, our failure to pay attention to these issues of accountability. And I think we've got to turn it around, whoever's president.
But he's on his way out. Isn't that the ultimate accountability?
It's a very good form of accountability, but believe me, most of the problems are still there. For example, the whole question of what your secret police and investigative agencies do, what they can do, what their charters are like, what kind of congressional oversight is exercised, it's still there. The president has to face it. The whole question of the extent to which you can invade individual rights is still there. These are issues that we're going to have to deal with, and Mr. Ford can help us deal with them.
Mr. Gardner, what was the one lesson that we now know came from Watergate that the American government didn't heed?
Well, I think that there were so many lessons and so many acts. One of the most telling things about this was the enormous number of acts that you simply couldn't catalog. They were so numerous. But I think the plain truth is that any government which doesn't face the fact that it will ultimately be held accountable is making a grave mistake.
Thank you. Thank you. John Gardner, Walter.
Roger, could I ask Mr. Gardner a question? Mr. Gardner, there's been a lot of talk, of course, over the last recent days and again today, of various sorts of immunity for the president should he resign tonight as expected. Would you advise the withholding or dropping of civil suits against the president, which are possible after his resignation, such as those of the 17 people who were wiretapped during his administration, damages by them and others? Would you advise that?
Well, let me answer it in two parts. First, I don't think there's any legal way to do that. Second, I believe one of the great and significant attributes of our performance in the past 6 months certainly has been the slow, orderly way in which we have deliberated in all of these matters. The question you raise is one that should be examined with very great care and not answered off the cuff, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Thank you, Roger. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout the evening, and we'll be back with more of this special report in a moment. 44 minutes from now, Richard Nixon goes on national television and radio, and it is expected that he will announce at that time his resignation as President of the United States. Connie Chung has been talking to some of the White House aides, I guess, or others around the White House at any rate. She's with Dan Rather out in front of the White House right now.
Walter, one of the high-ranking White House aides who has been visible during the day and has been talking to reporters. It came as no surprise to reporters because this particular aide has long had a reputation of being less tense than many around this president and this administration, Stephen Bull. You may recall that the name Steve Bull came up several times in connection with the court investigation of what happened to the 18-and-a-half-minute gap on that tape from June 20th, 1972. At any rate, Stephen Bull was, again, as he had been earlier in the day, out on the White House driveway a few moments ago, and Connie Chung talked to him. It turns out that Steve Bull has seen the president. He's one of the few people that we have been able to talk to today who has actually seen the president for any length of time. And Connie, what were some of the quotes from Steve?
Steve said that the president was, quote, unbelievably serene, and that his exterior, he called it placid. Without saying that the president has decided to resign, he said that the president had no second thoughts about his decision. Also, we asked him if he was at ease with his decision, and Steve said, who knows? He said that the president was not distraught with his decision. He was not distraught today, but he was distraught yesterday when he was trying to decide precisely what to do. We asked Steve just what he intends to do, and he said that he was going to fly to California with the president, along with Presidential Press Secretary Ronald Ziegler, and that he intended to stay with the president as long as he needed him. He also said that he wishes the president would decide not to resign. In other words, that he would change his mind, that he still had faith in the president and he was very loyal to the president. And he also said that he thought that the president did not commit an impeachable offense and that the president's judgment was good, and that the president should do what he thought was best for the country, though. And if he thought resignation was the best thing, then that's what he should do.
A couple of things in that, Connie, match with what we have been told today was happening over the past several days, and also what President Nixon himself has written about himself in the past. You may recall that in 6 Crises, and this is not a precise quote, but I think the paraphrase is accurate, the president said that the tension on a person, speaking of himself, the distraughtness on a person comes in that period when he's trying to make up his mind what to do, and that he, Richard Nixon, once he has made up his mind what to do, he becomes cool. He becomes tranquil at the center. Now, flashback to Sunday. On Sunday, we know that at Camp David, the president talked to some of his closest aides. The decision was being made, should he step aside or not. The president, we're told, tentatively made the decision on Monday, yes, that he he would have to step aside one way or another. Then it became a question of how to do it. Some of his aides, Patrick Buchanan for one, for example, was said to be advising the president the best time to do it would be just before a Senate trial. Go ahead and wait until the House impeaches and bide time, and also to make it clear that, in Buchanan's turn of phrase, that the media and political opponents were hounding him out of office. The president, we're told, declined to accept that advice, decided he'd have to step aside. That was Monday. Then Monday evening, aboard the Sequoia, his daughters urged him to reconsider. He did, and what he's been going through the past couple of days is reconsidering it, basically at his daughter's request. Apparently, sometime yesterday, he again made up his mind, after reconsidering it, that he would do what he had originally had intended to do. So that fits with what Steve Bull was saying. Now, I think you also saw Patrick Buchanan here, did you not?
That's right. Let me add one more thing about Steve Bull, and that is that he said he thought the president was amazing because of his mood and his manner today compared to perhaps the past few days when he was trying to come to his decision. He said that he has not said goodbye to his staff yet, and he didn't say when he would say goodbye to his staff. With respect to Pat Buchanan, I saw Buchanan in the driveway of the White House, and he was just getting into his car and driving away. He said he had not seen the president in 2 days, and that he assumed that the speech was completed, but he had not seen the president and had no knowledge of how the president felt or what the president was thinking.
We had been told earlier in the day by people close to the inner circle at the White House that the speech the president is making tonight would be prepared primarily by the president himself, with some help from Ray Price and one or two other speechwriters in polishing the language, and that Mr. Buchanan, while involved in helping the president put together the speech, was not as intimately involved as he had been in some others. So that would dovetail with what Patrick Buchanan said. It is obvious that Mr. Buchanan, who long had the justifiable reputation of being one of the most loyal people to Richard Nixon anywhere around this president, is disappointed, to say the least, at the way things have gone. It is fair to say, however, that Mr. Buchanan and others who shared his feeling in the White House over the past few days in particular have their whole demeanor, their whole manner, their whole tone and mood and atmosphere has been one of gentlemanly resignation. Walter?
Dan, it's interesting to note that although the president's decision may have been made Sunday at Camp David or Monday, the speech was still being worked on, as I understand, late this afternoon. That the Ray Price version was before the president, and he was working it over with some last-minute changes and additions of his own. And we did hear a report, I think, at one time this afternoon, whether accurate or not, I have no way of knowing, that the president would indeed be extemporaneous in some portions of his talk tonight. Have you heard that, Dan?
Yes, I think the plan, Walter, one reason the president wanted to write as much of this speech as possible himself is for the president, insofar as possible, to speak extemporaneously, and we are told that he particularly wants the ending to be something, and this is the way it was put to us, where he can look people in the eye and tell them how he really feels, and he wants to end the address by the television cameras going to the seal of the President of the United States.
While the president perhaps indeed is as placid as you, Connie, and Dan have reported it, it may be that with that placidity, he is having to help calm some of the members of his own family, because you reported earlier, Dan, and the press services have finally picked up that Tricia and Julie broke down tonight, his daughters, when they realized that the resignation was actually coming tonight, and when they learned of their father's decision to go right ahead with it. And as one aide is quoted as saying tonight, they're in a state of shock, a state of disappointment. And one of the wires, I think, said earlier today that Mrs. Nixon spent part of her day comforting the president. It sounds likely that Mr. Nixon was comforting his family.
That certainly was the scene last night at the family dinner, that members of the family were described as being in tears, and the president was said to be in that mood of placid passivity, and that he was trying to reconcile the family to his decision. Walter, who can say when the history of this period is written again upstairs in the living quarters of the White House, where there is that magnificent view, one of the great views of the world, where the president and his family can look out over the Washington Monument, over to the Jefferson Memorial, past the fountains on the south lawn of the White House. Who was comforting whom? But every available piece of evidence is that President Nixon, once he reached the decision, has been by and large, the comforter, and not the one being comforted.
Well, we have another 36 minutes to go until we hear his own version of how it is to be stepping out of office, the first president in our history to resign that high post. This is the culminating act, the final act of his administration, of course, and the final act, as far as he's concerned, in his administration of the thing known as the Watergate scandals. Daniel Shore and Fred Graham have covered Watergate almost since the break-in, the very beginning. Gentlemen, now as one of the final acts, and perhaps post-Nixon administration acts, is this question of immunity. What do you hear on that today?
Well, Walter, I guess you're asking us to step in as foolish reporters where that wise man, John Gardner, feared to tread. He ducked that question when you asked him about it. And what we're going to try to do is not to express opinions about it, but try to bring to bear Fred Graham's considerable legal knowledge and my less considerable background on it as to what we are talking about. This word immunity has sprung into public consciousness today as some magical new word. Senator Brooke proposed immunity in return for something like a full confession. That's not gotten very far in Congress. The issue of immunity is more an issue for justice than it is for Congress. And let me first ask you, Fred, how does one go about giving immunity if there is such a thing to be given?
Well, Dan, that's the problem here. The event that made immunity so volatile in this situation was, of course, the disclosure earlier in the week of the 3 transcripts of the June 23rd, 1972 conversation between the President and H.R. Haldeman, in which the President is pictured as attempting to impede the FBI's investigation for the stated reasons of protecting his political position. And that could be obstruction of justice, which, of course, is a felony. We are told, Dan, that among the other transcripts of those other 64 tapes is at least one other bombshell, perhaps of similar magnitude. The President has said he's going to make those public as he sends them over, as he sends the transcripts over to Judge Sirica, and so that could come in several days. And Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, can be confronted now with a situation in which it appears to a good bit of the world that the President may have been guilty of obstruction of justice. Jaworski would appear to have little choice other than to heed the Watergate grand jury, which has already voted on the basis of less evidence, of course, to include the President's name as an unindicted co-conspirator. If he resigns tonight and is no longer President, then he loses his immunity. He could be indicted along with the others. The Watergate grand jury, that same grand jury, will be in session until the 5th of December. And unless the Vice President, Ford, upon becoming President, grants immunity, or someone else, or the Congress somehow grants immunity, it would appear that the President, the ex-President, would be very much on the spot.
I talked a while back to the one man who's had experience in plea bargaining in a situation like this, and that's Elliot Richardson. As Attorney General, he arranged the plea bargain for Vice President Agnew. I asked him at the time, how could that be arranged for President Nixon if it were to be arranged for him? He said the difficulty there is twofold. One is you can't bargain until you know everything that the person has done. He said we knew that in the case of Agnew. We don't know that in the case of President Nixon, and I doubt that it's even known now. The other difficulty that he mentioned was that the authority to bargain for a plea has to derive from somebody. In the case of Agnew, it was the President. In the case of President Nixon, there doesn't seem to be anybody. And so the President, if he has no immunity, steps down naked to what comes next. Walter?
Fred and Dan, there is one other aspect of this thing. Even if the President is not charged by the present sitting grand jury, the one that's charged all the rest of these people, isn't it almost inevitable that he'll be called as a witness in that trial beginning next month of the 9 Watergate defendants?
The answer is... Walter, I've been told by some of the attorneys for other defendants that he will clearly be called. There's been some suggestion that he might also be called for the prosecution. So
Unless that is, of course, no one knows what will happen tonight, but the President could, if he chooses to, preclude those trials tonight by pardoning his lieutenants who are facing trial, perhaps on the ground that now that he has admitted his guilt, that they were less guilty or not guilty having accepted his orders. We really don't know what's going to come tonight.
And that's, of course, what we're waiting for. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout the evening, and this special report will resume after station identification.
This is a CBS News special report. Here again is Walter Cronkite.
30 minutes from now, President Nixon makes what it seems will be his last address from the White House. He goes on the air, and it is reported he will announce his resignation as President of the United States. That has seemed to have been the fact for the last 9.5 hours, at any rate, since he called Vice President Ford into the Oval Office, and in a 1 hour and 10-minute private conversation with him this morning, reportedly told him he has decided and will announce tonight on his resignation. George Herman is at Capitol Hill for the Senate view on the question which now is being asked on whether some sort of immunity might be offered to the president against prosecution for any wrongdoing in the White House during his administration. George?
Well, Walter, I listened to the legal discussion between my colleagues Dan Shore and Fred Graham with some interest, because up here, I guess you'd have to say it's not viewed so much as a legal question as it is as a political question. I think the members of the Senate that I've talked to are more concerned with what they would call the practical political realities of the situation. Some of them feel, for example, that if there were a sense of the Congress resolution that the president should be granted immunity, that most prosecutors, especially federal prosecutors under President Gerald Ford, most federal prosecutors would yield and not prosecute, not because of legal force, but because of the practical politics of the situation. Some of the members of the Senate see the question of immunity as part of what I guess my colleagues called plea bargaining. I don't know whether you can call it resignation plea bargaining. And on that, I think it's pretty clear that they've been doing a little old-fashioned political body English. They've been sort of trying to send a message to the White House without saying it in so many words. Senator Mansfield and Senator Byrd have said publicly, sending the message via the media, that if there's to be a successful resignation, meaning a resignation that leaves the country happy, leaves the country united, or comparatively happy, that leaves the country united without a bitter taste in its mouth, that it must be a resignation which admits to some degree of guilt on the part of the president. In other words, he cannot simply say, I'm bowing out because it is for the good of the country, or I'm bowing out because my leaders in the Congress in both houses have told me that I have to because I am going to be impeached and convicted. They feel that he must come up with some kind of a resignation which admits to some guilt on his part for the good of the country. That's the way they see it. And so they've been trying a little bit of the carrot and the stick, that if he does not resign in that form, that is to say with some admission of guilt, then the impeachment and the trial could conceivably go on. In fact, Senator Mansfield twice, on Tuesday and on Wednesday, said that he thought it was too late. Things had gone too far. The trial should go on. The trial would have to go on. Well, that's not a view that is generally shared up here, but a lot of senators appreciated that Senator Mansfield, and to a lesser extent with him, Senator Robert Byrd of Virginia, the assistant Democratic leader, were sending that message to the president. If you don't come up with a resignation which is acceptable, we still have this alternative. We still could go through this. That is not widely agreed to in the House. Speaker Carl Albert has demurred to that. On the other hand, the question of immunity, as I have indicated, has many, many dimensions. Speaker Albert feels that that is not the business of the legislative branch of the government, because immunity can be granted only by the executive branch, where the prosecution would be continued. But as I mentioned earlier on, Senator Javits feels that it would be kind to take this burden away from the incoming president, Gerald Ford, so that he would not be forced to make the decision to whether he would allow prosecution of the man who made him vice president and subsequently is making him president, so that Congress could take this decision, this painful decision, away from the new president, Gerald Ford, and make it for him. Make it, once again, not in a fully legal sense, but in a political sense, set the scene, set the stage, set the emotions of the nation so that it would not be wise or fruitful for any prosecutor to try him. None of this, of course, applies to the question which was discussed by Dan and by Fred of being a witness at a trial. It applies only to immunity. But on that score, I think what you've seen here now is 2 days, perhaps 2.5 days, of body English by the Congress trying to extract from the president, without doing it in so many words, the kind of resignation they would like to see from him. One other problem might be mentioned, and that is the dilemma of the Republican members. They wanted to get the word to the president that his chances were virtually nil. On the other hand, they certainly did not want to fall into the trap of urging him to resign. That could be very dangerous historically. It would leave the president to say, either in his resignation speech or in his history books to come, that he wanted to stay on, he believed he was innocent, but he was urged and even pressured by his own party, and that is something that they have not wanted to do. So what you've seen here is a sort of very careful maneuvering, very careful sending of signals, sending of messages without putting them into words which could then be quoted. And only time will tell whether they have succeeded or not. Walter, I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
George, it also leaves all of that speculation, leaves one other possibility, of course, and that's that the president could be sued in a civil action. And there's almost no way, as I can think of, or that I've heard, that immunity could be granted in that case. Indeed, it would be most unfair and hardly equitable to do so, since a civil action is the action of one citizen against another citizen. And you couldn't legislate against the right of another citizen to sue, I should think.
To the best of my knowledge, that has not been discussed up here in any fashion. I don't think that it has come up at all. Various legal possibilities have been discussed, but they've almost all had to do with forms of direct immunity. I don't think any member of Congress, any group in Congress, wants to put itself out on that particular limb, which I must say, if I can mix metaphors, would be an awfully sticky one.
The American people continue to wait for the president to speak. We've been around the country at a couple of our locations where they are waiting. And Sandy Gilmore of KMOX-TV in St. Louis is waiting with some of them.
Walter, we are in a suburban St. Louis shopping and entertainment center, and I think you could best describe the mood here as being one of anticipation, relief, and resentment. This is, of course, the show-me state of Missouri, and many people here say that they still need to be shown that the president is indeed guilty and he is not simply being railroaded out of office by Democrats, they say, and also by the media. We've been hearing comments all day like, you news people got what you wanted, and Mr. Nixon should stay and fight it out. I talked with a Democratic ward boss who owns a bar in a working-class neighborhood in St. Louis City. He said the regulars in his bar today feel that a resignation will hurt the country. They said that the country was falling apart. What will the Russians think? They will think we are weak, he said. Many people here are still arguing, indeed, the president's guilt or innocence. And so if the president's statement tonight falls short of a confession, if it comes out to be, as some people said, another checkers speech, then many people here will still say that President Nixon has been unjustly ousted from the White House. This is Sandy Gilmore, CBS News in St. Louis. Walter?
The man who President Nixon defeated for the presidency in 1968, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, vice president under Lyndon Johnson, and burdened with the Vietnam War as his principal difficulty, presumably, in getting to the presidency himself. Well, President Nixon defeated him by 0.7% in their very close race. Former Vice President Hubert Humphrey was interviewed earlier today in Minneapolis by Rod Challenger of WCCO-TV.
Senator Humphrey had refrained from calling for the president's resignation, wishing to keep it out of partisan politics. But he says now that resignation was the right choice, both for Nixon and the nation.
I believe the nation needs relief from this tremendous tension under which it has been for the last year and a half. There's a need of getting our country back together again, getting on with the business of government. There are tremendous problems facing us. The nation needs to be brought back together. We've simply got to restore our sense of confidence and restore trust in government.
How do you feel history will judge the Nixon presidency?
Mixed. In the field of foreign affairs, it will be judged well. In the field of domestic affairs, I think poorly. But in the matter of the conduct of the office, particularly in these recent months, I think it will be judged harshly.
Should Mr. Nixon be granted immunity from criminal prosecution by Congress?
That's a matter that will have to have a very careful study. There's no need of hurrying on this. The president will have suffered greatly, may I say, simply by the resignation, having to give up his office. I'm not one that wants to pin somebody to the wall, so to speak.
This is Rod Challenger in Minneapolis.
Our CBS News coverage continues throughout this evening. The President's speech due in about 20 minutes from now. We'll be back with more of the special report in a moment. We're excited with President Nixon's administration presumably with only hours yet to run. The reports being very strong that he will resign when he goes on the air 15 or so minutes from now. We've had no contraindication, certainly, for the last 10 or 12 hours. What about this matter of presidential power? Has the lesson come through, and will the balance between the executive and the legislative be greater, do you think, in this next administration?
I think it will. It's natural in human events and in nature, I guess, that a force going a certain direction keeps going that direction until it meets an obstacle, and a big one. And this tide, this high tide of the so-called imperial presidency has been going on since Franklin Roosevelt. It's been carried now to its ultimate extreme, I think, by Mr. Nixon. It's no accident that his man, John Ehrlichman, said, of course we have one-man rule, because he's the only nationally elected officer. That was their state of mind. This has gone to the brink and over. I think you'll get a new balance if Mr. Ford now becomes president. He comes in with one great advantage, that people will wish him well. He'll have the sympathy of the country. All that will be the case, as it's been before. His great disadvantage will be that he will be the first president not elected either as vice president or president by the people. And the man he picks as vice president in the next few days, presumably, also will not have been elected. We've never had a situation like this. And he, of course, will have the Congress against him politically and in party terms. Mr. Nixon was the first man to take over the presidency in his first term with both houses against him, the first man for over 100 years. The same will be true with Mr. Ford, and he'll have maybe even a bigger Democratic majority after the election in November. But there will be a different kind of a balance, at least for some time. This Congress has already restricted the presidential war-making powers. It is already arranged for much greater authority of its own over the budget-making process as it goes along. That'll make a big difference. It wants now to limit the size of White House staffs, presidential personal staff, and their immunity from testifying before Congress and all that kind of thing. And the courts have asserted once again their supremacy in the matters of law as to what the Constitution means and what the law is. They say they shall determine that, whether it's the president, whoever it is that tries to act or think otherwise. This is bound to be a new balance, but the Congress will have to, if it's going to exert more authority, more lead, it's got to find new ways to conduct its day-to-day business. It has to be much more efficient.
I think we'll be talking about this much more later on when we really know what happens tonight at the White House. That we should emphasize that with all of this conversation, we're going on the assumption that the president is going to resign. That assumption is based on considerable fact from the day. The fact that House Minority Leader John Rhodes said early in the afternoon, shortly after noon, that President Nixon would announce his resignation today. Many high White House sources confirmed that to newsmen at the White House. President Nixon has been closeted this afternoon with his speechwriter, Ray Price. Vice President Ford, after an hour and 10-minute meeting with the president this morning, then this afternoon met for 2 hours with Secretary of State Kissinger, talking about foreign affairs and a continuation of them, as we understand it. We have heard tonight that President Nixon is planning to fly tomorrow with his family to San Clemente, and not in the president's own plane, Air Force One, but one of the VIP planes made available to the White House staff. It all points to resignation tonight when the president goes on the air about 15 minutes from now. Tonight's events are being closely watched, not only here, of course, but around the world as well. And let's call in some of our foreign correspondents. Bruce Dunning, for instance, in Tokyo, Japan.
Walter, for
For Asia, the fate of Henry Kissinger is just about as important as the fate of Richard Nixon. Most statesmen here expect that if Mr. Nixon resigns, Kissinger would remain as Secretary of State at least for a few months to lend continuity to America's foreign policy, and that continuity is the most important issue for Asian governments. Probably the most worried about Mr. Nixon's possible departure, however, would be the Chinese government in Peking. Mr. Nixon is the symbol of China's improved relations with the West, and a resignation could undermine the men who invited Mr. Nixon to Peking. China has serious internal problems right now, and though no Western observers agree on just what direction this will take, they do know that Zhou Enlai, the man who led the turn toward the United States, has been seriously ill. Some people think his power is being eroded. The Chinese government reportedly is questioning Western diplomats in Peking very closely about the impeachment process and what effect Mr. Nixon's departure might have on U.S.-China relations. But so long as Kissinger stays on, at least through a transition period, most Asian governments should feel reassured that a resignation by the president would not be disastrous for the world situation. Walter?
There's every probability that shortly after the new administration comes in, Secretary of State Kissinger will be on the wing again around the world, reassuring our allies, as well as those with whom we've been attempting to establish détente over the last few years, of the continuation of the Nixon foreign policy under his successor, President Ford. It may be that President Ford himself will wish to engage in some summitry of that nature. That we will learn later as well. Besides those watching from the distance, halfway around the world in Tokyo, of course, there are those with a close-up view right outside the White House grounds, and Bob Schieffer is there with them in Lafayette Park. Bob?
Yes, Walter, we were talking just a moment ago about what some of the effects might be of a transition. One of those that many officials at the Pentagon are wondering about these days is what would be the effect of a transition from a Nixon administration to a Ford administration. And this afternoon, we talked to several people at the Pentagon about that, and they told us that this kind of a transition would be an easy one for the Pentagon. In the first place, they say that Mr. Ford's views on national defense are very much like those of Mr. Nixon. They also point out that Mr. Ford is well-grounded in defense matters. For many years, he was a member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee when he was in the House of Representatives. It was while he served on that committee, among other places, that he became very good friends with former Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird. Mr. Laird, you know, was also a member of that committee. As a member of the National Security Council, Mr. Ford is well-versed on defense matters and is up to speed, you might say, on what is going on. He gets regular briefings from members of the National Security Council staff. At one point, you'll recall, Vice President Ford seemed to feel that the current Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, simply did not have the political expertise to sell the Pentagon's programs on Capitol Hill, and he said at one point that if by some chance he should become president, he would try to find another Secretary of Defense. Mr. Ford, when he made those remarks, thought they were being made off the record. He was genuinely embarrassed when they showed up in print. Since that time, he's made a real effort to get to know Mr. Schlesinger. He talks to him often on the phone, and he often has breakfast with him. The result, aides say, is that Mr. Ford has come to have a real appreciation of Mr. Schlesinger and his abilities, and so the bottom line of it all is that if Mr. Ford does become president, he's now expected to ask Mr. Schlesinger to stay on as the chief at the Pentagon, and Mr. Schlesinger is expected to stay.
It's also noted, Bob, that if he becomes President Ford, his attitude all along has been that on the economy, he goes along with the Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Mr. Arthur Burns, in believing that one way to bring the economy under control is to cut back very severely in government expenditures, except for the Pentagon, and he believes in maintaining a strong defense, regardless of cost, presumably.
That's right, Walter, and he has defended that Pentagon budget time and time again on Capitol Hill. One thing that people at the Pentagon were talking about today was they expect the Pentagon to have a bigger voice at the White House. They expect more direct contact between the Secretary of Defense on a face-to-face basis and a President Ford. This has never been confirmed officially, and Mr. Schlesinger, of course, would never comment on it officially, but we've determined that Mr. Schlesinger, until the cabinet meeting this week, had not even talked with President Nixon since well before the crisis in Cyprus. Now they expect a much more open relationship.
That, of course, has been the story that we've heard frequently around Washington about the president's relations with most of the cabinet members, and it is expected that Gerald Ford will have a much closer relationship with all of his cabinet members and be much more open. The access will be to him by all of the staff. And speaking of his briefings by the military, in an interview in the New York Times this morning, he said that he felt entirely prepared to take over the presidency, that in these 6 months or 8 months or so that he's been vice president, that he has had regular briefings at the State Department and from the CIA, as well as the military briefings of which you spoke, Bob, that he's had weekly meetings with the White House Congressional Liaison man, William E. Timmons, that he's visited every executive department, conferred with every cabinet member and most of their aides. And so he feels that he's coming into the presidency fully prepared to take over. Well, Americans are waiting for that speech due less than 10 minutes from now, all across America, as we've shown you over this last hour and a half or so. And that includes, of course, San Francisco, where Richard Threlkeld reports.
Walter, San Francisco has never been very friendly to Richard Nixon. They voted 3-2 for McGovern here in 1972. Most of the people here, however, in Ghirardelli Square are tourists, pretty much a cross-section. They come here to get away from it all. Not all of them, you sense, really appreciate affairs of state like the resignation of a president intruding upon a vacation. Some people we've talked to here who've been watching the news on television just now were not even aware of developments the past few days. But as time approaches for the president's speech, the crowds are growing, almost like reading tomorrow's newspaper today. They know what's going to happen, and they want to see it. You don't sense either much joy or much sorrow among people here, just a kind of stunned suspense, as if it all really hasn't taken hold, as if almost it's all happening in some other country to some other people.
We'll be coming back to you a little later on this evening for a reaction after the president speaks, a speech which is due now in about 8 or 9 minutes. We understand that the speech of the president, in which he's expected to announce his resignation from office, will begin about 45 seconds after 9 o'clock. That's time to permit all of the television networks and so forth and radio networks to join in after the beginning of the hour. It'll begin at about that time. Important, one of the important elements of this whole dramatic story today is the reaction on Capitol Hill, of course. The Congress, the executive branch of our tripartite system, has played a major role in the downfall, really, of President Nixon, in the sense that it was the Senate Watergate Committee that exposed for the first time to the public, or confirmed to the public for the first time, that exposure that had been taking place in the news media on the extent of White House involvement in the Watergate and associated matters. It was the House Judiciary Committee that just 10 days ago voted to recommend to the House the impeachment of the president. Roger Mudd, of course, his principal beat here is Capitol Hill, and he probably is as close to the mood of Congress as any man I know. Roger?
Well, Walter, it's very hard to forget tonight that Gerald Ford once said that an impeachable offense is what a majority of the Congress at any one time says it is, and that definition can be filled out now by just reporting that it turns out that the impeachable offense that was committed by Richard Nixon on Monday was in effect making fools of many members of the Congress by releasing the transcripts of June 23rd, 1972. He in effect destroyed, or helped destroy, for a day or two, the credibility of about 10 members of the House Judiciary Committee. And therefore, members of the Congress now are very wary about going out on the limb in defense of the president or on declaring themselves as being in favor of a grant of immunity. Congressmen are really not aware of what public opinion is on a possible jail term against the president. They are decidedly ambivalent about it. They are afraid to say that the president should be granted immunity, and yet, as Senator Brooks so poignantly said as we saw him tonight on the evening news, I just don't want an American president behind bars. It's a very difficult position for a congressman to be in, and as a consequence, most congressmen are trying to thread their way between these two shoals, giving him a blanket grant of immunity or letting him stand his own chance. The heaviest difficulty the president faces is what he already knows is coming, is that the Watergate grand jury named him as an unindicted co-conspirator. If the president is not given a grant of some sort of immunity that would stay the hand of federal prosecutors, it is very likely that a federal grand jury could be reassembled and the president of the United States, the ex-president, could be indicted as a co-conspirator in the Watergate cover-up. Politically, the whole situation on the Hill is now very fluid because the Democrats lose by this change of power. Mr. Ford is now a viable, candid, honest, open president of the United States who immediately picks up an enormous reservoir of respect and goodwill from the public. Democrats, Walter, have openly admitted that they would prefer to have Richard Nixon stay because politically it would be much easier for them in '76. I don't know what this does to the Republican aspirants for the presidential nomination in '76. Charles Percy, who obviously wanted to be president, I think he still does, said this afternoon that his candidacy would have to be put on the back burner. I asked him, you're not turning off the stove, are you? And he said, no, he wouldn't turn off the stove.
We should remember, Roger, that Vice President Ford has said right after he became vice president and for some months thereafter, although I don't think we've heard it for a while, that he would definitely not be a candidate for the presidency in '76. But I don't think there's anybody that would really bet on that tonight. Let's recount quickly in these next 2 minutes before the president is due to speak the events of the last few days. As you all know, on Monday evening, President Nixon released transcripts of a June 23rd, 1972 conversation, 3 of them with H.R. Haldeman, his aide in the White House, which revealed that he did indeed know the details of the Watergate break-in long before he earlier had said he knew of it, and that he had instructed Haldeman to see if he could enlist the CIA to try to call the FBI off from that investigation. It seemed to be an admission of what indeed was included in the charges in Article 1 of the House Judiciary Committee's vote on impeachment, and that is a charge of obstructing justice in trying to cover up the Watergate affair. Well, as soon as that happened, the leaders on Capitol Hill, his friends on Capitol Hill, his defenders in the House Judiciary Committee, among others, and those in the Senate, as Roger Mudd reported to you a moment ago, began hour by hour announcements of their dropping away from his support. That was the beginning of the headlong retreat from President Nixon, and the last chapter then seemed to be inevitable. That chapter began developing really this morning as Vice President Ford was called into the White House Oval Office, and the president sat down with him for an hour and 10 minutes of private conversation. The reports began flooding Washington immediately thereafter that the president would resign tonight, and it was announced that he had asked for this television time at 9 o'clock to make an announcement. It has never been officially said by either Vice President Ford or President Nixon that the president would resign tonight, but all of the indications certainly have been that, and we've even been told that the president has an intention of leaving with his family for San Clemente tomorrow. Vice President Ford, it is reported, will take the oath of office at noon tomorrow and will go on the air tomorrow night with his first address to the American people as the 38th President of the United States. This is indeed an historic day, the only time a president has ever resigned from office in our nearly 200 years of history. You see the White House there, and in the White House in just a few moments now, President Nixon will be appearing before the people, perhaps for the last time as President of the United States. He is ready before the cameras and the microphones now, and we will be going in just a few seconds into that room where the President will make his fateful announcement to the American people. We are standing by now for President Richard Milhous Nixon, 37th President of the United States.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. As I recall the high hopes for America with which we began this second term, I feel a great sadness that I will not be here in this office working on your behalf to achieve those hopes in the next 2.5 years. But in turning over direction of the government to Vice President Ford, I know, as I told the nation when I nominated him for that office 10 months ago, that the leadership of America will be in good hands. In passing this office to the Vice President, I also do so with a profound sense of the weight of responsibility that will fall on his shoulders tomorrow, and therefore of the understanding, the patience, the cooperation he will need from all Americans. As he assumes that responsibility, he will deserve the help and the support of all of us. As we look to the future, the first essential is to begin healing the wounds of this nation, to put the bitterness and divisions of the recent past behind us, and to rediscover those shared ideals that lie at the heart of our strength and unity as a great and as a free people. By taking this action, I hope that I will have hastened the start of that process of healing which is so desperately needed in America. I regret deeply any injuries that may have been done in the course of the events that led to this decision. I would say only that if some of my judgments were wrong, and some were wrong, they were made in what I believed at the time to be the best interest of the nation. To those who have stood with me during these past difficult months, to my family, my friends, the many others who joined in supporting my cause because they believed it was right, I will be eternally grateful for your support. And to those who have not felt able to give me your support, let me say, I leave with no bitterness toward those who have opposed me. Because all of us in the final analysis have been concerned with the good of the country, however our judgments might differ. So let us all now join together in affirming that common commitment and in helping our new president succeed for the benefit of all Americans. I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving as your president for the past 5.5 years. These years have been a momentous time in the history of our nation and the world. They have been a time of achievement in which we can all be proud. Achievements that represent the shared efforts of the administration, the Congress, and the people. But the challenges ahead are equally great, and they too will require the support and the efforts of the Congress and the people working in cooperation with the new administration. We have ended America's longest war, but in the work of securing a lasting peace in the world, the goals ahead are even more far-reaching and more difficult. We must complete a structure of peace so that it will be said of this generation, our generation of Americans, by the people of all nations, not only that we ended one war, but that we prevented future wars. We have unlocked the doors that for a quarter of a century stood between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We must now ensure that the 1/4 of the world's people who live in the People's Republic of China will be and remain not our enemies, but our friends. In the Middle East, 100 million people in the Arab countries, many of whom have considered us their enemy for nearly 20 years, now look on us as their friends. We must continue to build on that friendship so that peace can settle at last over the Middle East, and so that the cradle of civilization will not become its grave. Together with the Soviet Union, we have made the crucial breakthroughs that have begun the process of limiting nuclear arms. But we must set as our goal not just limiting, but reducing, and finally destroying these terrible weapons so that they cannot destroy civilization, and so that the threat of nuclear war will no longer hang over the world and the people. We have opened a new relation with the Soviet Union. We must continue to develop and expand that new relationship so that the two strongest nations of the world will live together in cooperation rather than confrontation. Around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, there are millions of people who live in terrible poverty, even starvation. We must keep as our goal turning away from production for war and expanding production for peace, so that people everywhere on this earth can at last look forward in their children's time, if not in our own time, to having the necessities for a decent life. Here in America, we are fortunate that most of our people have not only the blessings of liberty, but also the means to live full and good, and by the world's standards, even abundant lives. We must press on, however, toward a goal not only of more and better jobs, but of full opportunity for every American. And of what we are striving so hard right now to achieve, prosperity without inflation. For more than a quarter of a century in public life, I have shared in the turbulent history of this era. I have fought for what I believed in. I have tried, to the best of my ability, to discharge those duties and meet those responsibilities that were entrusted to me. Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes I have failed. But always, I have taken heart from what Theodore Roosevelt once said about the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deed, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievements, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I pledge to you tonight that as long as I have a breath of life in my body, I shall continue in that spirit. I shall continue to work for the great causes to which I have been dedicated throughout my years as a congressman, a senator, vice president, and president. The cause of peace, not just for America, but among all nations. Prosperity, justice, and opportunity for all of our people. There is one cause, above all, to which I have been devoted, and to which I shall always be devoted for as long as I live. When I first took the oath of office as president 5.5 years ago, I made this sacred commitment to consecrate my office, my energies, and all the wisdom I can summon to the cause of peace among nations. I've done my very best in all the days since to be true to that pledge. As a result of these efforts, I am confident that the world is a safer place today, not only for the people of America, but for the people of all nations. And that all of our children have a better chance than before of living in peace rather than dying in war. This, more than anything, is what I hoped to achieve when I sought the presidency. This, more than anything, is what I hope will be my legacy to you, to our country, as I leave the presidency. To have served in this office is to have felt a very personal sense of kinship with each and every American. In leaving it, I do so with this prayer. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
This thing short in the interest of the whole country. On the whole, it seemed to me as effective, as magnanimous a speech as Mr. Nixon has ever made. And I suppose there'll be many, even among his critics, who will say that perhaps that few things in his presidency became him as much as his manner of leaving the presidency. Certainly no attacks on his enemies, none on the press, as we did have from Vice President Agnew a year ago when he resigned. I think people will find it very hard to fault this. A man is certainly entitled to call attention with his last words as president to what he considers his positive acts, which are those of trying to make peace in this world. Obviously, that is how he wishes to be remembered. And perhaps that will be the positive side of his record, even for many years to come, I think.
It certainly was a conciliatory speech. He even paid tribute to those who have been in opposition to him, which hasn't always been the case with President Nixon's speeches, and said he was sure that their interests in the country were the same as his, but they approached the problem from different viewpoints. Dan Rather, our White House correspondent, Roger Mudd, our Capitol Hill correspondent, are with us also, along with Eric, in the studio here in Washington. Gentlemen, your reactions for tonight's speech.
Walter, I think it may very well go down when history takes a look at it as one of Richard Nixon's, if not his finest hour. He's to be made clear and can't be reemphasized too often, I think, as I think the president made clear in his speech. There is no joy in this for anyone tonight. No decent thinking American could take any joy out of this. That sadness is tempered by, for many, with awe for the constitutional process, what we sometimes call the system, which worked magnificently. It was that constitutional process. It was a process of law which brought us to this moment. The president in his speech made clear that he respects that, he understands that, he has that appreciation and that awe for it. He did give, and I would agree with Walter, what you said, he gave to this moment a touch of class, more than that, a touch of majesty, touching that nerve in most people that says to their brain, we revere the presidency, we respect the president, the republic, and the country comes first. Roger?
Well, just from a purely congressional point of view, I really wouldn't think that was a very satisfactory speech. It did not deal with the realities of why he was leaving. There was no accounting in the speech of how he got there and why he was leaving that Oval Room. That whole question of Watergate is all that anybody in the Congress has had on their minds for the better part of a year. Half the Congress has defended him. Half the Congress has gone out on a limb for him. In the absence of any explanation or any acknowledgement of the president's responsibility in the Watergate cover-up, the viewer is left to conclude that it was simply some craven politicians in the Congress who collapsed in their defense of the president, and solely because of that was he having to leave the presidency. I think that it was, from a congressional standpoint, realistic to think that the president would make some bow toward the Hill to accept the blame that he admitted last week was his. But there was nothing like that tonight, and I think that the Congress will not be in any sort of mood to even consider for a brief time a grant of immunity, even though it's not legally binding and really would have no effect. And I think in the absence of any congressional action on immunity, Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski will read that as a mandate to go ahead and proceed against the president in the courts of law.
Roger, what about the other aspect of the thing? Do you think that there will be calls on Capitol Hill now to go ahead with the impeachment process in order to convict the president, or at least lay out the evidence against the president before the people again in their Congress?
No, I don't, Walter. I think that the middle ground has been arrived at on the Hill. I think that that most congressmen now want it over, they want it behind them, and they have settled in their own minds no more impeachment, no further need to push the machinery of impeachment, but at the same time, no immunity. And that is the compromise they've reached. That puts the Congress in the position of not being vindictive, because you're not kicking a wounded man. But it also means that they are not permitting Richard Nixon to get beyond the reach of the law.
It might even be suggested that he was appealing for the Congress and prosecutors, wherever they may be, to let the matter now lie, inasmuch as he said that the first essential was now to bind up the wounds, and he wished to do so by taking this action, laying the gauntlet down to the others to also take similar actions so that the wounds will not be opened again.
Well, there is still to be accounted for in the country, it seems to me, a sizable body of opinion that would rightfully ask, is the President of the United States really to be beyond the law? That if certain crimes were committed and certain laws were violated, then somebody ought to be punished for them. Now, an awful lot of men have had their families broken up in the last year because of crimes that they have committed. They've said in the name of national security or whatever. The president said tonight that I think, mistakes of actions, some actions were wrong, he said, but those actions were in the best interests of the nation. But nonetheless, there's been an awful lot of sadness delivered on a lot of Washington families. Now, those people were not beyond the law. I think the release of the transcript of the June 23rd, 72 tape means probably that Bob Haldeman will go to jail, and that John Ehrlichman might well go to jail. And I think there must be some accounting for those Americans who asked after the Agnew case, why didn't Vice President Agnew go to jail? The only answer in the Agnew case is that the Vice President specified to certain criminal acts. He agreed to that statement, and that was the key point in the Justice Department negotiation in the Agnew case, that before they would absolve Mr. Agnew from federal prosecution, he would agree that he had violated the law. Now, in this case, there's been none of that.
Well, this will be weighed. This is going to be the agony of the next few days, if not weeks and months. The agony of weighing what you have said on the one hand, Roger, in the Congress and in the hearts and minds of the American people, weighing that against, on the other hand, the lack of appetite to more than that, the absolute determination, I think, on the part of most people, not to shoot at lifeboats. That here you have tragedies, human tragedies, in the whole wake of this mess over the past few years, and the whole sorrowed affair. You've had one human tragedy after another. And the question is, is there any real desire to add another to that? It is not an easy question. I don't mean to suggest that the answer is obvious tonight. I think it isn't. it is something that is going to require a great deal of thought, something unquestionably a lot of people are going to ponder. The point about is there equal justice under the law, which you have described? Here's the central question. There were any number of people, in fairness, I would say myself, after the case of the vice president, who said, how can you reconcile a young woman in her teens in Tennessee getting jail time for stealing a can of hairspray from a Woolworth-type store and then letting the vice president of the United States off? There was and is that argument, but I may be wrong. But my own assessment is I don't think that the American people, nor the Congress in the end, will want to pursue Richard Nixon if it can possibly be avoided.
Eric, we have absolutely no precedent, of course, for what has occurred tonight. Never before has this happened in our history. But how would you look upon the chances of this conciliation that the president seemed to be requesting?
Well, you can only hope, and I don't think it's for any of us to say whether or not he should be prosecuted or whether or not the Congress should go ahead, with, at least on the House side, with an impeachment process. And I don't know whether they're going to. I do not believe that Special Prosecutor Jaworski will prosecute the president or not prosecute him on the basis of what he said or did not say tonight. I would think that would depend on a great many other factors, including the possible surfacing of new evidence of a damaging kind, if that should happen. The whole tone of this speech tonight, and it's appealing directly, of course, to the people, not just to congressmen, prosecutors, I think would make it much harder for congressmen or prosecutors to be rough about this with Mr. Nixon, because they are subject to the backlash of popular feeling, and I think he's appealed to that tonight. And I don't know how one passes judgment about because other people have been convicted, he must be tried. I'm not Solomon, and I don't think any of us are. I think we just have to wait now to see what the sense is on the Hill and the prosecutor's office.
That public opinion will be important, as it always is in the affairs of a democracy, and perhaps we've had a little sampling of it tonight right out in front of the White House itself, where a crowd was gathered in Lafayette Park, and Bob Schieffer is with them. Bob?
Walter, I suppose we have 1,500 or 2,000 people outside the White House on the Pennsylvania Avenue side, and then across the street over here in Lafayette Park, where we are situated. I must tell you that I'm a bit surprised that this is as good-spirited a crowd as it is. It's really a mixed bag. There are all sorts of people here carrying all sorts of signs for and against all sorts of things. Many of them gathered around the TV positions here while the president was speaking, and were able to hear the president speak on the television monitors we have here. In general, it was a well-behaved group. There were really only 3 outbursts of emotion about 5 minutes into the speech, when the president said he was not a quitter. There was some laughter in the crowd here. And then a few minutes later, when the president announced that he would definitely resign, a great cheer went up from the people here. And then after the speech, people here applauded. They were not exactly what you would call cheers, but just applause. And then after that, the people began pouring across the street and across Pennsylvania Avenue up to the gates of the White House. For just a few minutes or so, the traffic on Pennsylvania Avenue was blocked. So all in all, here, I must tell you, I was a bit surprised at just how good-humored this crowd was, but it has been generally well-behaved.
We should report again the schedule of events from here on out. The president announced that his resignation will be effective as of noon tomorrow, and at that time, Vice President Ford will take the oath of office. We have been advised earlier that that oath would be taken in the Rose Garden, joining the White House Oval Office, and that before the Vice President takes the oath of office, President Nixon will have left the White House with his family, his 2 daughters and their husbands, and Mrs. Nixon, and will fly to San Clemente, California. Whether he will be there in time to hear Vice President Nixon swearing in or not, it seems highly doubtful. But that is the President's intention at this time. A longtime friend of the President and his Secretary of State at one time is William Rogers, and he's in New York right now with Mike Wallace.
Mr. Rogers, thank you for coming here this evening. William Rogers was for 4 years Attorney General of the United States. When Dwight Eisenhower was president, for 4.5 years, he was Secretary of State under Richard Nixon. And you're an old friend and a good friend of Richard Nixon. I wonder if you would tell us what you thought of tonight's speech of resignation, Mr. Rogers.
Well, Mike, I thought it was a very effective speech. No bitterness, no recriminations. As some of the commentators have said, he was magnanimous. And I think it's the kind of speech that the country needed. I hope it will unify the country. It certainly was a historic speech. I was impressed, as I am sure all Americans were impressed, by the strength of his delivery and by the composure that he had giving this kind of a speech. It would seem to me, in other words, that it was just the right kind of speech, extremely difficult for him and difficult for the country.
And you think that he dealt sufficiently with the Watergate matter?
Yes, I think so. The country knows about the Watergate matter. There have been tremendous disclosures in the last few months about it. And it seemed to me he said all that was necessary. Of course, what's important now, Mike, is for the country to get on with its business. This has been a difficult period for the country, but I think that we're going to be a stronger nation as a result of it.
A stronger nation?
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, it shows that the constitutional processes that we all respect and that can meet a challenge of this kind. This was a tremendous challenge for our country. And I think that when you talk to people from other parts of the world, they've been amazed at how composed our people have been. There's been no panic. Everyone has accepted the fact that the constitutional processes were working. Congress, I think, handled itself very well. Certainly the courts played a very important role, as they should under the Constitution. All in all, I think the nation will come out stronger than it has been in the past.
You know Gerald Ford pretty well.
Yes, I do.
People suggest that Mr. Ford, President Ford, has not had sufficient experience in foreign policy. You were Secretary of State for 4.5 years under Richard Nixon. Has not had enough experience in foreign policy to use as strong a hand, as knowing a hand, as perhaps President Nixon has.
Well, I don't know if he's had the background that President Nixon had when he became president for obvious reasons, but he's had a great deal of experience. He's been in Washington for 20 years. He's been a minority leader in the House for a long time, and in every time there was a major development in the foreign policy field, he received full briefings from the Secretary of State and from Dr. Kissinger and from the President himself. He's traveled a good deal. I think he knows the world picture very well, and I have no doubt at all that he'll be a strong leader in the field of foreign affairs. I also think it's important to keep in mind that Vice President Ford, tomorrow President Ford, is a man of great integrity. And he's a man who is very forthcoming. He says exactly what he thinks. I think he's a very strong leader, and I think that that kind of leadership is going to be of great importance in the years ahead.
In his speech, Mr. Nixon said that I have never been a quitter. In his book, 6 Crises, he writes that Bill Rogers was with him during 2 of those 6 crises, the Checkers Fund and later on the Eisenhower heart attack. What was he like at that time? People, of course, have marveled at the man's resilience over the past months.
Well, I think that this speech tonight demonstrates the kind of man he is. He's a man of great strength. I don't suppose that there are many people alive who could stand the strains that he's had for the last 2 years. Been tremendous. I mean, physical and psychological strains. And you could tell from his delivery tonight that he's a man of great strength. And it's interesting that when he is under great pressure, as he's been many times in his life, that his thinking is very straight, and he does what he, I think, is logical and best for the country, as he said tonight. And I think that the speech he gave tonight will be considered by the American people as a speech that was exactly right for the occasion. Very difficult time for him, for his family, but I think it was good for the country.
Thank you very much for coming into the studio tonight, Secretary Rogers.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes, Walter.
Hear me there? Hi.
Tonight, the president pledged, he said, I think the words were exact, I pledge I will continue to work for the great causes for which I have worked in the 28 years of his public life. You know him very well. As Mike said, you've been through 2 crises with him at least, 2 that he acknowledges in his book at any rate. Do you think it is conceivable that he would now work publicly in some area of civil affairs?
Yes, I think so. I'm not sure exactly what area would be. If you're speaking about public office, I don't think so. But I do think that he will continue to do what he said, and I think he will be an effective voice, particularly in foreign affairs. He's had great experience. He's given wonderful leadership to this country in the field of foreign affairs, as he said tonight, and I think the American people recognize, and there's no reason why he won't be able to contribute to the welfare of the country in the years ahead.
President Nixon, of course, is just 61. He should have a great number of years left if he does intend to devote them to public affairs. A great deal more could be heard from him.
And undoubtedly he will write and speak, and I think he will contribute to the nation's welfare.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. We have some late developments from Fred Graham, who covers the legal aspects of many Watergate cases. Fred?
Walter, we've just gotten a statement from Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, which indicates, by implication at least, that the possibility of criminal proceedings are still very much alive. If I may read it, Mr. Jaworski says as follows: there has been no agreement or understanding of any sort between the President or his representatives and the special prosecutor relating in any way to the President's resignation. The special prosecutor's office was not asked for any such agreement or understanding and offered none. Although I was informed of the President's decision this afternoon, my office did not participate in any way in the President's decision to resign.
Thank you, Fred. Vice President Ford, as far as we know, heard the President's resignation speech at his Alexandria, Virginia home in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and it's conceivable that he might step out of his house and make some brief appearance tonight, although none is scheduled, and the first scheduled appearance of the Vice President, as far as we know, is when he takes the oath of office at noon tomorrow in the White House. As you know, we've been reporting earlier, President Nixon and his family will be leaving the White House tomorrow morning, so it will be available for immediate occupancy by the new president and his family, 4 children, and Mrs. Ford. During the president's speech, Phil Jones has been at Vice President Ford's home in Alexandria, Virginia, and here he is.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President will be making a brief statement. At the conclusion of that statement, he will not be taking any questions. Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States.
I think that this is one of the most difficult and very saddest periods, and one of the very saddest incidents that I've ever witnessed. Let me say that I think the President of the United States has made one of the greatest personal sacrifices for the country and one of the finest personal decisions on behalf of all of us as Americans by his decision to resign as President of the United States. It's been my opportunity to watch over a period of nearly 25 years a foreign policy in the last 5 years that has been most successful in the achievement of peace for all of us here and hopefully the rest of the world. It's been a policy that I think can continue peace in the months and years ahead. Let me say without any hesitation or reservation that the policy that has achieved peace in built the blocks for future peace will be continued, as far as I'm concerned, as President of the United States. We've been fortunate in the last 5 years to have a very great man in Henry Kissinger, who has helped to build the blocks of peace under President Nixon. I think those policies should be continued. And those policies of peace will be continued. I have asked Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, to stay on and to be the Secretary of State under the new administration. I've known Henry Kissinger for a great many years. I knew him before he came with the Nixon administration. I want him to be my Secretary of State, and I'm glad to announce that he will be the Secretary of State, which means that he and I will be working together in the pursuit of peace in the future as we have achieved it in the past. We have many other problems. We have problems at home which must be resolved. And they can be resolved and will be resolved by the cooperation of the Congress with the President and those that work with him. I've been very fortunate in my lifetime in public office to have a good many adversaries in the political arena in the Congress. But I don't think I have a single enemy in the Congress. And the net result is that I think tomorrow I can start out working with Democrats and with Republicans in the House as well as in the Senate to work on the problems, serious ones, which we have at home. And the spirit of cooperation, which I believe will be exhibited with the Congress and the new president on the problems overseas and the problems at home, will be beneficial not only to 211 fine million Americans, but to the world as a whole. And I pledge to you tonight, as I will pledge tomorrow and in the future, my best efforts in cooperation, leadership, and dedication to what's good for America and good for the world. Thank you very much.
6-minute, completely, as nearly as we could tell, extemporaneous talk by the next President of the United States, Gerald Ford, who will take the oath of office at noon tomorrow in the Rose Garden of the White House, weather permitting, otherwise in the adjoining Oval Office. Gerald Ford is 61 years old, just 6 months younger than the man he is succeeding, a native of Omaha, Nebraska, and raised in Michigan. He graduated from the University of Michigan and the Yale Law School. He was in the Navy, as was President Nixon, during World War II. He was discharged as a lieutenant commander. In 1948, he married Elizabeth Betty Bloomer, and that same year was elected to the Congress of the United States. He has 4 children. Michael Gerald, who's 24, he's a theology student. John Gardner, who's 22, he's at the University of Utah this summer working as a forest ranger in Yellowstone National Park. Stephen Meigs is 18, working for the National Park Service in Washington this summer, and Susan Elizabeth, who is 17. The vice president, served in Congress continuously from 1948, was minority leader of the Congress, and on December 6, 73, was sworn in as President Nixon's choice under the 25th Amendment to succeed Spiro Agnew as the vice president, as the 40th vice president. Now, 8 months later, he succeeds to the presidency itself. One of the president's critics has long been Senator Henry Jackson of Oregon, who is here now with Bruce Morton of Washington.
Close enough, Walter.
Well, I got just one border away.
We were a part of Oregon Territory.
Senator, we've heard two speeches here tonight. Let me start by asking you whether the president said the kind of things you expected to hear.
Yes, more or less. Obviously, the note of sadness that prevailed throughout the speech made it difficult to make an evaluation. I mean, what do you say? I mean, what do you really say tonight? I think it's going to take quite a while to say what's really on our mind, and it's rather difficult after those remarks to comment.
One of the things that was being talked about on the Hill today was this whole idea of immunity and whether there was any role for the Congress in that, whether the Senate, as Senator Brooks suggested, ought to pass a sense of Congress resolution saying this doesn't have any binding effect, but we think Mr. Nixon ought not to be prosecuted. Are you for that?
No. No, I think that would run contrary to our whole system of jurisprudence, equality under the law. I think all of us were brought up under our system to believe that the law applies to the mighty as well as to the humble, to the rich as well as the poor, and that one's status in society should not be the test of immunity. It would, I think, have a very bad effect on all that has been accomplished to date. The story of this evening is the story of the wisdom of our founding fathers in putting together a system that has endured. It's the story of the greatness of our people. Even greater than the Constitution are our people. It's like the English system now. They don't have a written Constitution. They know what their rights are, and I think the American people know what their rights are. And the founding fathers laid that foundation in for our schools and for the process of training, education that's been going on, and to grant immunity at the summit, which is to be an example for all subjects of our nation, would be contrary to everything that our country stood for.
Senator Jackson, thank you. Walter?
With the president's resignation tonight, there ends numerous political rivalries. One with George Wallace, governor of Alabama. He's in Birmingham tonight, and so is our correspondent, David Dick.
Walter, it's a little hard to believe after seeing Governor Wallace on television tonight by videotape that we are in a hospital, and he actually came from his hospital bed to appear down here. Governor, how do you feel?
I feel all right, David. I've been here about a week, and I will be out of the hospital tomorrow, so I'm all right.
You had some post-surgery work?
I had some post-surgery work, that's correct. I had a stitch that didn't dissolve and had to be removed.
Walter?
Thank you very much, David, and Governor Wallace in Birmingham, Alabama. The President, Richard Milhouse Nixon, steps down from office officially at noon, but the announcement came at 4 minutes and 15 seconds after 9 Eastern Daylight Time tonight after about 10 hours of very intense speculation throughout the day, that that would indeed be his announcement tonight. He conferred with Vice President Ford this morning for an hour and 10 minutes in the Rose Room, in the Oval Office of the White House, and there Vice President Ford knew definitely that he was succeeding to the presidency as the 38th President of the United States. One of the President's most trusted aides has been Stephen Bull, and he's with Bob Schieffer at the White House now.
Walter, Steve Bull is one of the few officials who has seen President Nixon today. Steve, let me just ask you, what sort of a mood was the President in today?
I've got to borrow a term that was used by Senator Scott yesterday, which was serene. And I said earlier to Connie Chung, incredibly serene. I don't know how the man has the strength to adopt that composure.
Well, what's been going on in the White House these last few days? It's been just a scene of incredible tension outside, and to those of us, trying to figure out what's going on. How has it been to be close to the President and be with him during this time?
I'm at a disadvantage since I was out of the city on Monday, so I came in on Tuesday after the transcript had been released and was playing catch-up ball on it. But I think there was a period that was shared by all of us, which was uncertainty as to what was happening. I wasn't close in and knowledgeable of the substantive decisions that were being made, just kind of observing from about the same perspective that you were.
When do you think the President really made the decision to resign? Was it after the meeting with Senator Goldwater and Congressman Rhodes and the other leaders, or was it before that, do you think?
It would be only speculation, and it would be based on really just observing his patterns of behavior during this past 3 days that I've seen him over or against the last four or five years when he's had difficult decisions to make. I don't know when the decision was made, but it appeared that by this morning, because of his composure and I'll say the incredible serenity, that the decision was made by this morning.
We're told that throughout the day the President was doing such things as cleaning out his desk, other things, just like any person does when they get ready to move. That must have been a very moving experience for those of you who saw him.
I didn't see him cleaning out his desk or anything of that nature. In the brief glimpses I had, he was working on his speech, writing that speech, which I thought was an incredibly courageous speech, as was the delivery of it. And my esteem was just raised even more so after listening to him deliver it.
We are told, and he said tonight, that his family asked him not to resign. They wanted him to stay on. Can you tell us anything about the mood of the family?
No, I don't know anything about the mood of the family.
Well, what happens next, Mr. Bull? Now, the President will leave sometime tomorrow and head for California. You will be going with him, and
yes.
Mr. Ziegler.
Right.
Now, let me just get this straight. The President will leave Washington as President, as I understand it.
My understanding is that the President's resignation is effective at 12 noon tomorrow. Presumably, he will leave midday. Presumably, he will leave as president and will go to California aboard Air Force One, which is the Spirit of 76.
So he will be in the air while the oath is being taken by Vice President Ford.
I don't have a time that's certain for you. This is just a presumption on my part right now.
Steve, thank you very much. Walter?
Bob, the President is going out on Air Force One?
Yes, that's what Steve told us. He will be going on Air Force One, and he will be in the air while the oath is being given to Vice President Ford.
Bob, while you were interviewing Steve Bull there seemed to be something going on in the background, people shouting and honking horns. Have there been any demonstrations out in front of the White House?
Walter, I suppose we've got 2,500 people here now. This is Pennsylvania Avenue just behind us. We're in Lafayette Park, as we said earlier, and the White House is beyond Pennsylvania Avenue, just on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. People have been going back and forth across the avenue, and from time to time traffic has been tied up. I think we just had an automobile accident out there. In fact, I see a wrecker moving in now, so apparently that's what happened. While we had our back to it, I heard it as I was talking to Bull just now. But this crowd, I must say, and as I said before, I was very surprised at what high spirits this crowd is in. For some reason, I had just expected a much more somber mood here, but it has just not been that way, and I would be dishonest if I said it was.
We've heard a very strong statement from Capitol Hill that indicating that despite the president's appeal for conciliation, there are some voices, at least, that are going to demand a fuller accounting from the resigned president. The congressman from Texas, Wright Patman, a powerful voice on Capitol Hill, has issued a statement saying that he feels strongly that the anguish and pain which the nation has suffered for the past 2 years should not be in vain. We must learn from this experience. We must make certain that it can never happen again, that never again can the laws be so clearly flouted and the powers of the presidency so badly abused. And he goes on, to accomplish this, we must have all the facts in the public record. Mr. Patman says it is essential that the tapes being released to Judge Sirica under Supreme Court order be made available to the public, that the Judiciary Committee publish the transcripts as part of their public record. Additionally, correspondence and memoranda and other documents relating to this case should be preserved and made public in the same manner. It is important that the records of the Judiciary Committee be complete in this case so that future generations can learn from this experience and understand why it was necessary for the committee and the Congress to undertake this unhappy task, meaning the acts toward impeachment of the president. That's a statement from Democratic Congressman Wright Patman of Texas. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout the evening, and we'll be back with more of this special report in a moment. It is hard to imagine that there is anyone in America who has tuned in late, but in case there are a few out there, President Richard Milhous Nixon announced just a little less than an hour ago that he is resigning as the 37th President of the United States, that the resignation is effective at noon tomorrow, at which time Vice President Gerald Ford will be sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. It has been learned that President Nixon will fly with his family to San Clemente, California tomorrow, leaving the White House before Mr. Ford is sworn in. This so that President Nixon could leave the White House as president and not as an ex-president. He made no mention in his speech to the specifics of Watergate. He only said that if he had made any errors in judgment, and he had made some, he was sorry for those. But there was nothing in the speech in the way of a mea culpa, of any sort of a confession, of any sins in regard to Watergate, and that has been a matter of considerable discussion since his speech as to whether the Congress of the United States would be satisfied with the speech or would wish to take further action against the president. And the immediate reaction is that at the least the Congress will not now vote any sense of the Congress that he should be granted immunity from further prosecution. Vice President Ford made a brief appearance of about 6 minutes a short while ago outside of his Alexandria, Virginia home, and out in front of that home now is the man who has been covering the Vice President for many months for CBS News, Phil Jones. Phil?
Walter, it's beginning to rain here right now, and as you can see, it's dark behind me at 514 Crown View Drive. The Vice President has gone inside about 15 minutes ago. The porch lights have been turned off. You probably can't see them, but there are at least 2 Secret Service agents standing out here in the front lawn. After Mr. Ford went inside without answering any questions, just making his very brief statement, his press secretary, Paul Miltich, came out and had a very short briefing. A couple of interesting points and sort of puzzling, as a matter of fact. Mr. Miltich announced that there would probably be a meshing of the staff, the Vice President's current staff and the staff that will be in the White House after 12 noon tomorrow. Mr. Miltich did say that President Nixon's press secretary, Ronald Ziegler, will be flying on Air Force One with the president to California, and that means that he will not be at the White House after 12 o'clock tomorrow. That shouldn't come as much of a surprise because Mr. Ford, ever since he was designated, and matter of fact, when he was minority leader, expressed many times publicly the feeling that he didn't think Ronald Ziegler benefited the president much. And in the past few months, since he has been vice president, he's indicated, in fact, Ziegler was responsible for many of the president's public relations problems. We asked Mr. Miltich whether or not he would be press secretary to President Ford after 12 o'clock tomorrow, and he said he was not prepared to comment on that. There have been various reports around town tonight that Mr. Miltich will be replaced. We have not had anything official on that. There was one report that Jerry Terhorst, who is a reporter for a Detroit newspaper, a longtime friend of the vice president's, currently writing a book on Vice President Ford, will be named press secretary. Mr. Miltich said he could not comment on that. We asked who would be chief of staff after 12 o'clock tomorrow. Again, Mr. Miltich said no comment. He would not deal with any other announcements on the staff. The only thing we know tonight for sure is that Secretary of State Henry Kissinger will continue. That, of course, is not a surprise either, because Mr. Kissinger, several months ago, after it was reported, he was quoted as saying he would not, he would resign if President Nixon were forced out of office, was embarrassed by the fact that this hit the press. And a few weeks after that, the Secretary of State saw the Vice President and told him privately that he would be honored to serve in any Ford cabinet. So it's a mystery here tonight as to just what is going to happen after 12 o'clock tomorrow, where we don't know exactly when the Fords will leave their home here in Alexandria, Virginia, to move into the White House. But certainly after 12 o'clock tomorrow, Mr. Ford's new office will be the Oval Office at the White House. Walter?
Phil, have you had any clues at all there as to who soon-to-be President Ford will name under the 25th Amendment as his vice president? We've heard all sorts of names mentioned, of course, Nelson Rockefeller and Mel Laird, and among others. Well, what about that?
Well, the list is very long because what happened is Vice President, President Ford has many friends on Capitol Hill. And so these friends have been going around for the past day or so and listing all of the friends they know the Vice President has. I think that the list has at least a dozen names on it from all I can gather, and this is strictly unofficial. But it seems to be that high on the list, if not inside, is Melvin Laird. Mr. Laird, a longtime political friend of the Vice President's, will probably get at least first refusal on this, and certainly from all indications he would be more than happy to become Vice President. But a little background on this: Mr. Ford would not be moving into the White House tomorrow if it were not for Melvin Laird, because when Mr. Agnew left office, at that time, it was reported that President Nixon wanted to designate John Connally. And it was Mr. Laird, who was then on the White House staff, who went to President Nixon and said, you cannot get John Connally through Congress. And it was at that time that he suggested Vice President or Minority Leader Gerald Ford's name. I would say Mel Laird, number one. There is some speculation that Nelson Rockefeller is out totally because he would be unacceptable to the conservative Republicans. And the one thing that Mr. Ford wants to do is make sure that he is, as he's described himself, the calm conciliator. And he can't do that if he alienates any party, any part of his party.
Adding some credence to that, Phil, is the fact that Nelson Rockefeller has announced a news conference up in Bangor, Maine. He's up at his summer home up at Seal Harbor, Maine, and he's going to have a news conference in Bangor at 6:30 tomorrow evening. He announced that early this afternoon. It hardly seems likely that he would have made such an announcement that this afternoon, if he was going to be named the vice president. That would have to come first, obviously, from the president. And Mel Laird, untypical of Mr. Laird, is incommunicado today and tonight, supposedly at a fishing camp somewhere in Chesapeake Bay. Harry?
Well, Mr. Laird was around here today. He's been saying right up to today that he would not go back into government under any circumstances, that he needs a few years to make some money for his family for once in his life. There is the problem, of course, that to go put back into the House of Representatives again, have two men like Ford and Laird as president, vice president, might not sit well. They're both from the Midwest. That might not be the wisest thing to do. That could also take out Representative John Anderson of Illinois, a man of great respect in the House. And also there is the fact that whoever does become vice president with Mr. Ford could not run for the presidential nomination if Mr. Ford wanted it in 76. He just could not do that. If he wanted to preempt Mr. Laird or somebody like Elliot Richardson, I suppose that's one way to do it.
Or Nelson Rockefeller.
Rockefeller, put him on the ticket. But I think the business of all these names thrown out is an old political exercise. Remember what Lyndon Johnson did in '64. He had everybody thinking he was going to be picked. It helps placate the different wings of the party and makes a lot of people feel very nice.
A couple of the names that have been on the list are in the studio with us here tonight. The list is long, as you suggest, and really is rather meaningless, I suppose. But these gentlemen are important to the Republican Party, certainly. Secretary of the Interior Rogers Morton and Republican Party Chairman George Bush, and they're with Bruce Morton right now.
Walter, it's one of the marks of a political leader, of course, that he has an extraordinary and shrewd sense of timing. I should tell you that Mr. Bush was just telling me that the Republicans spent a good deal of time and effort planning just when to have their big televised fundraiser, and with remarkable foresight, they've scheduled it for tonight. In fact, it would have been preempted by the president's speech. Mr. Bush, if I may start with you, is this now an easier time to be a Republican? Is it going to be easier to campaign with President Ford?
Well, I think that remains to be seen, but clearly the country has wanted to get Watergate behind us, to coin a phrase, and this, I'd say, very courageous move by the president certainly will help do that. It removes the whole impeachment vote thing from the political process, and clearly it clears the political air, and it's a time for healing, and it's also a time where politics can be conducted on the fundamental issues.
Secretary Morton, is there also some feeling in the cabinet that, you sort of get back to business? The whole government has really been ground almost to a halt over this thing.
Well, I don't think really it has, but I think there is a sort of feeling of relief in that this is behind us. I think George's statement is accurate. I think that this is going to be a very exciting year for the cabinet because we've got most of our legislation now is in hand, and I think we've just got a lot of work to do, and it's exciting work.
Bruce, we leave the wrong impression, and I know Raj would agree with me. If we came off, just worried about the way I answered your question, if we came off kind of relieved yeah, I'm optimistic about our country, and I know the Secretary is, but I would be remiss if I left the impression of joy. I feel deep. Both of us have been intimately involved with the President. Both of us have taken enormous pride in his accomplishments, and if you don't mind my interjecting a comment, my feeling, just my personal feeling now is one of sadness, and yet the question was entirely proper because I think we will emerge into a much happier day. But I just don't want to leave the wrong impression. I came down here very reluctantly. I was invited cordially by Mr. Cronkite, and I'm delighted to be here, but I want to convey that because so many of us that have stood with the President in times past, and as he said, he's going to be involved in the future. I don't know what that means, but I would proudly in the future. And who have been depressed and turned off by Watergate and this kind of thing, I really feel a deep sense of tragedy and also, you might say, a deep sense of pride in that speech tonight, and I just want to, I know Raj.
Well, I feel very strongly that way. I think it's been a great privilege to serve in the Nixon cabinet. I really feel it's been an honor beyond anything I ever dreamed about, and I think we've gotten a great deal done. I'm unwilling to accept the paralysis theory that the government has come to a screeching halt. I just cannot accept that from where I sit. But I join with George that this has been a real emotional shocker for all of us. We've been a close-knit team in the cabinet, and certainly our association with the national chairman has been close, and this has been this is a moment of sadness. I think we've got a great future, but still I can't get over what happened tonight that easily.
Let me ask you both a kind of double-barreled question. Have you talked to Mr. Ford about staying on?
Yes, I have. He called me this afternoon and asked me if I would stay on. I said I certainly would. I'd be delighted to if that's what he wanted. I want to make sure that's what he wants.
And you are both on some of those vice presidential lists, which sprout up like weeds in this kind of situation. Would you accept that if
Morton made the list? There was one list of 25. I wasn't on it. I was deeply hurt.
That's not true. Oh, I think to get to your question, I think you do what you're asked to do, but it's not the kind of job you run for, and I don't think. I think this is a thing that Ford has got to come to in his own mind, and I don't think there should be any sort of competitive action.
You know, I heard this guy in his front yard speculating on it. My judgment, and I visited with the vice president today for 30 minutes, is he probably hasn't addressed himself to the question, and that's understandable. It should be soon, should be fast, but I don't think that maybe it's more going on that I would know, but I don't think he's made any determination on that.
Walter?
I'd like to ask Mr. Secretary Morton, excuse me, do you have any idea, Mr. Secretary, whether the entire cabinet was asked to continue to serve with the soon-to-be President Ford, and did they all accept?
I don't have any idea. No, I'm not. I don't know. I know that Secretary Kissinger has, and I know that I have, but I haven't checked around, and I don't know whether the others have or not.
We did hear reports earlier today from some of his staff that he was expected to ask the entire cabinet to stay, at least for the time being, certainly. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Very greatly appreciate your coming by our studio tonight. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout the evening, and we'll be back with more of the special report in a moment. President Nixon has announced that he is resigning from the presidency as of noon tomorrow. The new president will be Gerald Ford of Michigan. In his hometown of Grand Rapids, 3 of his brothers watched the power of the presidency fall to a member of their family. And just afterward, Ike Pappas talked with them.
I thought it was a very eloquent speech myself, Mr. Pappas. I thought it was very well done and very astutely put.
How about your feelings now about your brother? The awesome task that he has.
He has my greatest sympathy and wholehearted support.
Tom, how do you feel about what's happened to your brother this evening?
Well, it's frightening. It's frightening because if the public doesn't get behind and get off the negative thinking, we're going to continue to drift. And I'm positive of Jerry's ability to lead if we will get off negativism and get on some positive things about what's good. And I think Jerry can get along that line if the public will answer with their prayers and their help.
What do you think he has to do then as the first thing?
The first thing he has to do is to get the confidence of the people behind him.
Dr. Ford, knowing your brother as you do, what kind of a president do you think he'll make?
Well, first of all, I'm very proud of Jerry. I think he'll be very conscientious. I think he'll give 100% all the way.
Vice President Gerald Ford's brothers in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Vice President Ford to become the 38th President of the United States at noon tomorrow in an oath-taking ceremony in the Rose Garden, weather permitting, or in the Oval Office of the White House. The resignation of President Nixon is obviously a great personal tragedy to the president and to his family. It may also have in it the makings of a financial disaster as well, as Daniel Shore can tell us. Dan?
Yes, Walter. One of the things we now know tonight from Fred Graham's report that there is no deal at all with Prosecutor Jaworski, that among the things which will now go ahead is the special prosecutor's investigation of the president's taxes with a view to establishing possible civil tax fraud. Unless there is some kind of deal, and there is no indication either in the president's speech or anywhere else tonight that there is any deal for immunity, leniency, or anything else, the president's troubles will now continue. By resigning, he saves the $60,000 a year lifetime pension that he would have lost had he been convicted in the Senate impeachment trial, and there is every indication now that he will badly need that money. For although he tripled his net worth during 5 years in office to a figure of just over $1 million, His financial fortunes have fared as badly lately as his political fortunes, and he is now in serious financial trouble. We now know tonight from Fred Graham's report that there is no deal at all with Prosecutor Jaworski, that among the things which will now go ahead is the special prosecutor's investigation of the president's taxes with a view to establishing possible civil tax fraud. Unless there is some kind of deal, and there is no indication either in the president's speech or anywhere else tonight that there is any deal for immunity, leniency, or anything else, the president's troubles will now continue. By resigning, he saves the $60,000 a year lifetime pension that he would have lost had he been convicted in the Senate impeachment trial, and there is every indication now that he will badly need that money. For although he tripled his net worth during 5 years in office to a figure of just over $1 million, his financial fortunes have fared as badly lately as his political fortunes, and he is now in serious financial trouble. Mr. Nixon and his wife were obliged to pay some $285,000 in back taxes because of disallowed deductions. He still owes $148,000 in 1969 taxes that he doesn't have to pay but promised that he would pay. And his 1973 taxes may have run as high as half of his $200,000 salary because he couldn't use that leftover portion of the deduction for the vice presidential papers. Well, such expenses, it's believed, have pretty well eaten up the $462,000 in cash savings that the White House reported last winter as being held in B.B. Rebozo's Key Biscayne Bank. Last month, Mr. Nixon was unable to meet a big final payment, almost $190,000, on his San Clemente home, and he got a 6-month delay. He may have further financial problems depending on what happens now. For example, as I mentioned, the special prosecutor is apparently going ahead with the question of possible tax fraud. If he lost the fight on that, it could mean a civil fraud penalty of around $196,000. Also in California, there are disbarment proceedings going ahead. And the president, as you know, Walter, made $100,000 from his law practice every year before he became president. So he leaves office with most of his savings exhausted by back taxes and mortgage payments, owing maybe $250,000 in more back taxes and mortgage payments. And, well, there are troubles for the president.
Incidentally, Dan, Robert Ablanalp, who is one of the president's close friends, along with B.B. Rebozo, and a financial advisor, and one of those who helped put together the San Clemente purchase of the property out there, wired the president this afternoon his continued loyalty and support. Whether he is going to be able to come to the president's financial assistance or not, or is going to be willing to, remains, I suppose, to be seen.
He has said that he's willing to help the president refinance the mortgage payments on his San Clemente home. That home, as you may remember, is the home that he promised to give to the American people after his death. He may very well have to sell his Key Biscayne home.
Thank you, Dan. A very important figure, of course, in the days ahead as to how the Congress treats the president, the recent president, Mr. Nixon, is House Speaker Carl Albert. And he was interviewed in the House Radio TV gallery and asked how he assessed the president's speech.
He went out not trying to say that he was framed, as some people said he would do. He did not do that. And I think he did a service for the nation in not doing that. I think his speech was more than conciliatory. I think it was a call to the nation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, even though you suggested it earlier today, now after the fact, may we assume that impeachment proceedings will come to a halt?
Well, the proceedings themselves, I'm sure will come to a halt. The committee is in the process of preparing its report. The committee has not finished what the House asked it to do. The committee will have to report back. The House may have to take some sort of action, but I am sure the end result of it will be that the president, having resigned, the impeachment proceedings will come to an end.
One of the president's strongest supporters in the Congress is Senator Strom Thurmond, and he's here with Roger Mudd now.
Senator, how will the South, which you know so well, accept the resignation of Mr. Nixon?
Well, of all the telephone calls I received today, and we received a large number, and telegrams too, only one was in opposition to the president. They wanted him to serve on. He's very popular in the South. After all, he has accomplished a great deal as president. He ended the war in Vietnam, which was started under another administration. He brought about a detente with the Soviet Union and opened communications with Red China to preserve peace in the world. He advocated revenue sharing, which sends money back to the states, and money is power. He stood for a strong national defense. He appointed strong men to the Supreme Court. They are reversing some decisions, and I think this is helping the country. As a whole, I think he's made one of the greatest presidents in my lifetime.
Well, then why is he leaving?
Well, did you hear his statement tonight?
Yes, but...
He said he was leaving because he felt it was in the national interest, that if he remained on, he would have to devote a large part of his time to preparing his defense for Watergate, and that he felt that this would take too much time, and therefore he felt that a president should give his full time, and he was resigning for that reason. In other words, as I construed his position, and I thought he made it very clear, and you're a very intelligent man, and I'm sure you understood it.
But my question was directed at whether or not his political base in the Congress had eroded to that extent. Do you believe that?
I do think it had eroded. I think since his admissions on August the 5th that his condition had eroded some, and I think that it would have been more difficult for him.
What are your relations, Senator, with the new president, Gerald Ford? I know you had very close ones with the old one.
Well, Mr. Ford and I are good friends. We've got along nicely. We both worked for the election of President Nixon in '68 and again in '72. And it's my judgment that he is a man of strong integrity. He's a man of proven ability. And he's a man of great dedication and capacity, and I think he'll make an excellent president.
Thank you, Senator Thurman. Walter?
Not long after the president's speech, Governor Ronald Reagan of California held a news conference, and he had this to say.
We must turn our full attention to the other problems that face our nation, and I join with all Americans in pledging my full support to President Ford as he leads the nation into more tranquil times.
Do you think the president should be criminally prosecuted?
No, I don't.
That line shouldn't be pursued?
No, I certainly think that anyone who could believe that there is any punishment beyond what he and his family have undergone in this is certainly lacking in compassion.
Governor, you were one of the men on the list. Go into more of the Watergate matter itself.
What's that?
Were you disappointed that he did not go into more of the Watergate matter itself in his speech tonight? Do you think he should have had some explanation about that?
No, I felt that the president, first of all, I have to say he displayed a courage and a control that under the circumstances I doubt if many men could have matched.
Governor Ronald Reagan of California. Our CBS News coverage continues throughout the evening, and we'll be back with more of the special report in a moment. President Nixon announced tonight, a little over an hour ago, that he is resigning as President of the United States. Made no reference directly to Watergate, but said that he may have made some mistakes in judgment, but they were all in what he thought were the interests of the United States and its people. That was his only reference at all to possible culpability. He did appeal for conciliation in his 16-minute speech. Gerald Ford of Michigan, also 61 years old, becomes the 38th President of the United States upon the President's resignation officially at noon tomorrow. Eric, you were saying a moment ago as we were passing a quick word to each other that these events of the last few months really have been a prelude to the centennial,
yes,
bicentennial.
It's been a prologue, an opening chapter for the bicentennial. How would we have approached it if we'd gone on and on this way? We couldn't have. Not with a fresh mind and some basic faiths restored, but now I think we'll be able to. We've had, throughout this business, and especially through the hearings in the Judiciary Committee, the country's had a short, rather painful, but saturation course in what the Constitution of this country is all about and what the rule of law means and why this country was supposed to be different from the old world. And now we can approach this in a new spirit. We have, in fact, been going back and asking James Madison and Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and a few others what they wanted us to do in this situation. What should we do? And they've told us. We've understood it. There's been a consensus on that. And maybe I'm a little romantic about this, but I think this has been an enormously helpful refresher course in what we're all about. On quite another subject, Secretary Morton mentioned a few moments ago that the government has not been paralyzed through all this. Many big decisions have, but the machinery of government has gone on. And that is a tribute, I think, to the civil service here, the bureaucracy, if you will. It does function, no matter the crisis at the top, because it's now a very old and very experienced and routinized, institutionalized set of institutions. And we can be grateful for that.
You know, Eric, in relation to that, I had a note here, and I was looking for it because I scribbled it down earlier today. The White House continued to function, executive branch in the White House, right on through the afternoon. The handouts, the announcements of appointments, some minor judgeships to the Alaskan Fisheries Commission, an appointment. He signed a couple of bills today. You're right, the government continued right on through this crisis day.
And I can understand why a man like Mr. Morton would want to continue as secretary, continue in this cabinet, or any member who is at all congenial with the new president, Mr. Ford, because they are going to have a much better time as cabinet officers than they had in at least the first 5 years of the Nixon administration, for the simple reason they have not got this cabal in the White House, headed by Haldeman and Ehrlichman and a few others, who really attempted to run their departments from those offices in the White House and the EOB, as well as to do a great many other things, trying to run almost everything, and blocking off Congress for the president.
The one thing we've heard continually through these years of the Nixon presidency is the closed nature of the presidency, the lack of relationship between the president and his members of his own cabinet.
Yes, they did all complain of that, and the spirit of those particular men around Mr. Nixon. For example, the morning after the great victory in the election of '72, the meeting of the staff people, cabinet people, one former cabinet member told me his utter dismay about this. Of course, there's jubilation and entitled to it. They'd had a great victory. But the whole undertone then, especially from those staff people, was now we're going to get them. It was one of revenge and vengeance, which did not sit well. Now, you won't have any of that now with General Ford.
The president tonight in that 16-minute speech of resignation certainly hinted at none of that now. As you said earlier, right after the speech, this was one of magnanimity, conciliation, and none of that vindictiveness or bitterness which we have heard some previous speeches of the president's. House Minority Leader John Rhodes, the man who succeeded Gerald Ford in the congressional leadership post just 10 months ago, was asked tonight how the incoming president will get along with the House and the Senate.
I would imagine that he will be the most effective president, at least in recent history, insofar as his congressional relations are concerned, because Gerald Ford is a creature of Congress. He came up through the Congress. He's been in the Congress for 24 years, and I can't imagine that he'll have any problem in dealing with his old friends here.
Mr. Rhodes, in terms of the speech itself, there were those in the Congress who suggested that unless Mr. Nixon confessed and took full blame for his actions, that they felt the impeachment process should continue. Do you think that he took enough blame upon himself that the impeachment process should stop?
Well, I think that people who feel like that are vindictive, and I don't think that the majority of the American people could possibly have any sympathy with that viewpoint. This president has agreed that he made mistakes. He has agreed that he should leave that office to which he was elected by an overwhelming majority, and I think that anybody who wants to have him do anything else is merely trying to perpetuate a divisiveness in the people of America and the body politic which he tried to heal. I hope they would be as big as he is.
A little while ago, we reported that Governor Rockefeller had called a news conference in Bangor, Maine for 6:30 tomorrow evening and related it to these events that have transpired in Washington today and tonight. And indeed, that's the way it was reported by the various press services this afternoon. But now Governor Rockefeller's press secretary says that tomorrow's news conference is unrelated to today's events and instead is related to a Maine Young Republicans meeting that had been scheduled for a long time. But it does seem odd that there should have been an announcement late this afternoon of the news conference tomorrow at any rate. But presumably one is scheduled for whatever purpose. Bruce Morton is here in our studio in Washington now with some more friends of Gerald Ford.
Walter, I have three people here who, in different ways, have come to know Vice President Ford. Sitting next to me, Saul Friedman of the night newspapers, including the Detroit Free Press. Next to him, Congressman Clement Zablocki, Democrat of Wisconsin, an old colleague of the Vice President's in the House. Next to him, Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico. Saul, I might as well start with you. What kind of a man is Gerald Ford? More specifically, what kind of an administration is this going to be? How will it be different?
Well, we've been hearing a lot about Middle America from Southern Californians and Floridians for the past 5 years. Ford of Grand Rapids is Mr. Middle America. He is a near-classic conservative in a much more genuine sense than his predecessor, who was conservative until political expedience made him rule otherwise. I think Ford, in a sense, is a return to the conservatism that the Ripon Society and other conservative commentators would want to see. And I think that he'll begin to prove it with his economic policies, which I think will become evident very quickly. I think he believes that the sick economy is the first priority, and he's going to attack it. And in the last public speech that he made before this business happened today, earlier this week, he made it very plain that he was going to pursue some tough, rather classic, conservative economic policies which probably will border on austerity. I think that when you take a look at a Ford administration, however it turns out, he is going to be criticized or liked for the right reasons for a change.
Mr. Zablocki, Senator Domenici, it's traditional that new presidents get a honeymoon with the Congress. This president takes office in a rather different way, but can he count on a little bliss from you?
Oh, there's no question that Vice President Ford, tomorrow President Ford, will have a period of a honeymoon because he has many friends in Congress. I came in the same class with Vice President Ford, and there were some questions as to whether he is fit to be president on the basis of his knowledge of international and foreign policies. I think he has demonstrated that he is very well versed in this regard. And he's a man of great integrity. I found over the years, being able to observe him, that he has an ability to meet people and make friends. For example, in my own personal case, we've had differences. The most recent was on the War Powers Bill. We differed, and he strongly differed, but he nevertheless was a gentleman, and he's been a good loser when we overrode the president's veto in that particular instance.
Senator?
Well, I have no doubt that he will have a honeymoon, to borrow your words, with the Congress. Just recently, in the last 3 or 4 days, in talking to young senators of both parties and a couple of Democrats that stick out in my mind.